I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story and all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 326 Signature. Charles's car slowly drove into the town of Darvaz amidst cheers from his neighbors. If Laurent hadn't ordered the guards to strictly prohibit all strangers from entering, a large number of reporters would surely have surrounded him for interviews. However, when Charles got out of the car, several people still ignored the guards' attempts to stop them and squeezed in front of Charles, asking for autographs. One of them was Teddy, who held 3 notebooks in his hand, flipping through them one by one for Charles to sign. Charles asked suspiciously, "What do you need an autograph for?" "I wrote my name in every notebook I had at school. It's not what I asked for," Teddy explained with an innocent look. "Someone hired me to do this. They think I'm your classmate, so it's easier to get an autograph." "Hired you?" Charles's hands flew across the notebooks, writing his name, his gaze turning to Teddy with a puzzled expression. "Yes," Teddy nodded, answering innocently, "1 franc per notebook." Charles rolled his eyes and handed the signed notebooks back to Teddy one by one. "Then you should give me half. I have an idea, perhaps we could collaborate. I'll sign the notebooks, and you contact the buyers." "What do you think?" Teddy's eyes lit up. "Are you serious? That's fantastic, a really good idea." The neighbors burst into laughter. They all knew Charles was joking. With Charles's current wealth and power, how could he possibly do something like selling autographs? However, Charles thought to himself, if he could earn 1 franc for writing a name, he could easily earn several hundred francs a day. This might be much better than competing with capitalists in the capital and military industries. Stepping back into his home, he suddenly felt a sense of familiarity mixed with strangeness towards the small house he had lived in for over a decade. It was indescribable. At that moment, Charles unconsciously re-examined the world and experienced a breath, flavor, and meaning of life. It was like his soul touching his body. The past was a nightmare, one he couldn't completely erase even after emerging from the fear, making his joy at surviving all the more intense. In a daze, Camille brought Charles a glass of hot milk and a plate of leftover cake from breakfast. Charles wasn't hungry at all. His eating habits had been completely disrupted on the battlefield, only allowing him to nibble on bread when he was starving, but he ate quietly with gratitude. This was life, Charles thought. "They said you landed at Gallipoli." Camille's eyes held a hint of tension. "Yes," Charles nodded. "And how was it?" Camille asked with difficulty, seemingly afraid to reveal Charles's unpleasant past. "Don't worry, Mother," Charles replied easily, "it's by the sea, and I'm a staff officer. I've always fought under someone else's protection, it's just a different location. I can even sunbathe on the beach and sleep in a swaying hammock. Look at me, I'm all tanned." Camille didn't know what the battlefield was like anyway, so she would believe whatever he said. Camille seemed relieved. But Joko saw through Charles's lie. If things had really gone as smoothly as he claimed, his eyes wouldn't have been filled with relief and reminiscence as he walked through the door. However, Joko didn't call him out, only nodding slightly. Charles's lie was almost exposed. He slept for 2 whole days, only getting up once a day to eat, then going back to sleep. This was because he was severely exhausted. He could barely sleep in the trenches, and now he seemed to be making up for it all. Sometimes Charles couldn't help but wonder what about the soldiers who stayed in the trenches fighting the enemy? Charles had only spent about 2 weeks in the trenches, while the soldiers generally stayed on the front lines for 3 or 4 months, and if they survived, they would get a rare vacation. Charles thought that perhaps they had already come to regard the trenches as a habit. On the morning of the 3rd day, Charles was woken up by Joko. "Major Laurent is waiting downstairs. He said you will be questioned by the council today." "Oh?" Charles opened his eyes groggily, staring blankly for a while before remembering that there was indeed such a thing. "What is it because of?" Joko carefully closed the door after entering, sat down in a chair, and asked in a low voice, "Is it because of your battlefield situation?" "No, Father," Charles replied, "it's because of the uniform. I want to change into a different uniform." Joko cautiously asked, "If possible, could you make some kind of compromise and not go to the battlefield? I mean, Like some kind of exchange, Charles fell silent. He understood Djoka and Camille's thoughts. They would rather give up everything and surrender to the capitalists for their own safety. Charles stood up and put on his uniform, replying, "We have no way back, father. Even if I'm willing to give up everything, do you think the capitalists will let me go? Is there no other way?" Djoka still clung to a sliver of hope. Charles gently shook his head. Charles's existence was a danger to the capitalists. What the capitalists feared was not the factories, workers, and capital Charles owned, but the ideas in Charles's head, and the support of the French people. How could Charles surrender? Give them his head? Or destroy his image in front of the French people? After getting dressed, Charles said to Djoka, "Safety is something we create ourselves, father. We can never rely on the pity of others. That would be handing over the power of life and death to the enemy." With that, Charles opened the door and went downstairs. Djoka stared blankly at Charles's retreating figure, suddenly realizing that Charles was no longer the Charles he once was. He seemed to have grown up, and become much stronger. Even more so, a murderous aura and ruthlessness emanated from his very bones. Then Djoka understood, it was forged on the battlefield. He was almost certain that the situation in Gallipoli was not as Charles described. On the contrary, it was a cruel, torturous experience, even a test of life and death. On the way to the House of Representatives, Charles casually flipped through the documents Colonel Laurent had handed him. These were the preparations Gerlini had made for Charles's upcoming questioning over the past 2 days. Charles had originally thought that parliamentary questioning would simply involve answering their questions or explaining the reasons for changing uniforms to the members. After reading the documents, he realized that he should understand some basic facts, such as which members opposed changing uniforms, why they opposed it, and what the different reasons were, etc. However, Charles merely glanced at the documents, set them aside, yawned, tightened his infantry coat, and closed his eyes for a nap. "Aren't they useful?" Laurent asked curiously. The general ordered Lieutenant Colonel Fernand to collect them. "No, they're very useful," Charles replied softly. "But they can't control the outcome." Chapter 327 Charles' Theory. The Paris Chamber of Deputies, usually a noisy and chaotic place, with its debating members resembling haggling hagglers at a market, displaying utter disrespect and lack of manners, fell silent the moment Charles, dressed in military uniform, appeared at the door. Everyone stared at him as he walked steadily down the aisle to the podium. This was unprecedented. Even Galeri's questioning hadn't resulted in such complete silence. The members' expressions varied, some admired, some grateful, but most were filled with envy and anger. Grévy's expression was complex. Sometimes he couldn't help but wonder, did he really hope Charles wouldn't return from the battlefield? Or, if it did happen one day, would he be happy? Perhaps not. Charles stood on the podium, speaking with neither arrogance nor servility. "Greetings, gentlemen." He then breathed a sigh of relief. "Finally, I don't have to speak amidst the sounds of gunfire. It feels good." The members of Parliament laughed, and Steed led the applause, shouting, "Well done, Charles. You are the pride of France." Several others joined in. "You defeated the Germans, the Ottomans, and the British. You saved many lives, and this war, ... This was a campaign to promote Charles. But what they said was true, and the members of Parliament who opposed Charles, though their faces showed displeasure, had no way to refute it and could only quietly wait for the applause and shouts to subside. Charles preemptively spoke before the councillor could even ask a question. "Let me state my purpose. I'm not here to advocate for myself. Changing the style and color of uniforms will do me no good. I don't own textile mills, dyeing plants, or clothing factories that produce uniforms. I'm here for one purpose only, to prevent our brave soldiers from risking their lives for unnecessary reasons. This will make the battle more complicated, victory more difficult, and survival harder." Wells, sitting in the center of the audience, secretly applauded. A very clever rhetoric. Charles had declared from the beginning that he was advocating for the people. Anyone who objected would be seen as going against the people and disregarding the lives of soldiers on the front lines, a serious crime that could instantly cost a councillor supporters and even lead to public scorn. But the councillors were not so easily dealt with. Armand stood up, interrupting Charles. "Colonel," Armand asked, "are you objecting to the bright colors of the uniforms?" "Yes," Charles replied calmly. Then, Armand said, "The British uniforms were also brightly colored." "No," Charles replied. "Parliamentary inquiries were usually simple, and unscrupulous members often didn't give the questioned party time or space to explain. Then why did the French army, wearing brightly colored uniforms, win? Armand asked. While the British suffered a crushing defeat, a murmur rippled through the room. Yes, victory or defeat has nothing to do with whether the uniforms are brightly colored, or brightly colored uniforms bring more victory. It's a French tradition. Changing uniforms is tantamount to surrendering to the enemy. Charles waited until they finished shouting, then coldly replied, "Gentlemen, if that's what you think, then may I ask you to wear brightly colored uniforms and go to the battlefield?" The opposing members instantly lost ground. They realized that no matter how they answered, it was inappropriate. To say yes meant they would go to the battlefield. To say no meant asking others to fight bravely in brightly colored uniforms while they themselves hid in the rear as cowards. Steed and the other members echoed Charles's sentiments. At this moment, a member of parliament stood up and asked Charles seriously, "Colonel, have you realized that these vibrant colors are not just aesthetically pleasing? They can also make soldiers look energetic and invigorating, which may be the key to victory. Is that so?" Charles smiled and asked in return, "Why don't I feel that?" "It's a subconscious feeling, Colonel," the member of parliament replied. Red represents an impulse. It symbolizes blood, and the basic requirement for offense is impulse. It makes soldiers more likely to charge at the enemy with bayonets drawn rather than be afraid or even run away. Hearing this, Charles seemed to understand. The red caps and trousers of the French army were not simply a matter of good-looking or bad-looking, they were also related to the French theory of offense. Warfare requires inspiring soldiers to attack the enemy. What those in power wanted to see was soldiers, under the psychological suggestion of red, impulsively charging into the enemy trenches with bayonets drawn, and then achieving victory. Charles smiled and replied logically, "I'm sorry, sir, I can tell you with certainty that in all the battles I have commanded that I've won, not a single one was because the soldiers were motivated by their red trousers and red caps. On the contrary, from the very beginning, I ordered them to hide behind the tanks and preserve themselves." Immediately, someone else stood up to object. "Colonel, are you opposing the offensive theory?" "You could say that," Charles readily admitted. Although opposing the offensive theory was considered unorthodox at this time, Pétain was precisely the one who stood out. The reason was simple: actual combat was the only true test, otherwise, no matter how eloquently one explained it, it was useless. Everyone present was astonished, even Steed fell silent. The characteristic of counselors was to follow the crowd, and at this moment, the general direction was still the offensive theory, so they dared not easily go against the tide, even if this person was Charles. Then, the questioning shifted from military uniforms to the offensive theory. "So, you support Pétain's defensive theory?" Grevy stood up and asked, a hint of smugness on his face, as if he felt he had caught Charles off guard. "No," Charles shook his head in denial, "I also do not support a defensive theory." This answer baffled the counselors in the room. Warfare was either offense or defense. Was there an intermediate state? But indeed, there was an intermediate state, and it should be. Charles replied, "Sometimes we need offense to win, and sometimes we need defense." Then he tilted his head down, his eyes filled with confidence and determination. "The battlefield is a very complex arena, gentlemen, far more complex than you can imagine. We cannot expect to win indefinitely using simple offensive or defensive theories. That's like our past belief that we could win all wars with just 75mm cannons. That idea will ultimately fail." Whether it's offense or defense, the room fell silent. The counselors all realized one thing: Charles's military theory might be unique, different from traditional offensive theories and Pétain's defensive theories. It was Charles's theory. Charles had consistently used this theory to achieve victory on the battlefield. In other words, the facts had already proven Charles's theory correct. What could they possibly argue against? Chapter 328 Steel Helmet. The parliamentary questioning ended with a series of tedious questions, such as, "Colonel, do you believe your military talent surpasses that of Foch and Pétain? You believe their military theories are flawed, so why were they still able to achieve victory on the battlefield? How do you explain this? Would you use your military talent to benefit your company?" Charles calmly answered each question. "This is not a matter of military talent, sir. We are all learning through war, and I certainly do not believe I have surpassed them. Everyone has different opinions, which is normal. Which military theory is correct, I believe, should not be answered by me, but by the battlefield, the facts, and the soldiers. This is important because it concerns the lives of soldiers, They have the right to choose what tactics to use in battle. I am benefiting my company? No, sir. I do not think so. I have always been benefiting the French people. Charles's answers were evasive. The members of Parliament did not actually want to know the answers to these questions. They were intelligent men who knew that military theory's truth revealed through practice. Discussions of right and wrong were useless and meaningless. It could only be determined through battlefield experience and victory. They asked the question anyway, their aim being to offend both Foch and Pétain. Foch was the deputy commander-in-chief of France and commander of Army Group North. While his power was less than Joffre's, his influence far surpassed Joffre's, as the entire army was employing his offensive doctrines. Pétain, though a junior officer, was already showing promise. Pétain, a staunch advocate of defensive doctrines, served as a second lieutenant for 5 years, a first lieutenant for 7, and a captain for 10 before the war. He was a colonel commanding only a regiment, but by then he was 58 years old. As the saying goes, circumstances shape people. The trench warfare of World War I perfectly aligned with Petain's defensive theories. He led his troops to numerous victories on the battlefield, rising through the ranks to brigadier general and then major general in just a few months, eventually becoming commander of the 33rd Army Corps. Offending these two veterans would do Charles no good. It would only give the impression that he was arrogant and disrespectful of his elders. As for whether Charles was acting in the best interests of his own company, the members of Parliament tried to portray him as a capitalist seeking to monopolize the arms market and control the country. Although Charles did indeed think this way, he couldn't say it aloud, otherwise the newspapers would immediately launch a verbal attack on him the next day. Charles sighed inwardly, "This is a war, but a war without gunpowder. Every word, every question is a trap. One wrong step and you'll fall into it." The capitalists were like magnifying glasses on Charles. If he said anything wrong, it would be seized upon and magnified infinitely. Fortunately, Charles knew how to handle it. He just needed to act big, speaking ambiguously, as if answering but not answering, and he would succeed. Finally escaping from Parliament, Charles returned to the City Defense Command headquarters, not far from the House of Representatives. Gallieri seemed to be waiting for Charles. As soon as Charles appeared at the entrance to the corridor, Gallieri looked him up and down and said, "You seem quite at ease. Colonel? I underestimated you." "Not really," Charles replied helplessly. "I feel more tired than fighting a battle." Charles was telling the truth. The April temperature was still cold, but Charles was already drenched in cold sweat when he walked out of the House of Representatives. Then Charles asked doubtfully, "They didn't tell me the result, General. Whether it passed or not, no one told me." "You thought you'd get a result immediately?" Gallieri smiled smugly, but his eyes held a hint of helplessness as he looked at Charles. "They'll need at least a few days, or even longer, Colonel. If it passes, the bill has to be sent to the Senate, where it has the power to veto it. If it's vetoed, is that the end of it?" Charles asked. "No," Gallieri shook his head slightly. "The House of Representatives can propose it again. If it's rejected by the Senate 3 times, and then passes it a 4th time, it doesn't need to be submitted to the Senate." Charles understood. The Senate's rejection also meant delaying time. The decision-making power always remained in the House of Representatives. If the House insisted on passing a certain issue, it would definitely pass. It was just a matter of time. No wonder modern countries that adopted this system were so inefficient. The interests of the parties in the two houses differed, pulling each other back and forth, digging pits for each other. Even if it passed in the end, it might have already missed the opportunity or become useless. It's like changing military uniforms. If you wait for these procedures to be completed, it will take at least 6 months, and at most 1 or 2 years. By then, the war will be over. What's the point of passing it smoothly? That's why we need wartime procurement regulations, Gallieri explained. It can bypass Parliament to procure equipment, but changing military uniforms is not just a matter of procuring equipment. Charles nodded in understanding. Just as the members of Parliament said, it also concerned the dignity of France and whether the soldiers were willing to attack. These fools actually hoped that red military trousers and caps would motivate soldiers to charge the enemy. Charles recalled the red fez caps of the Ottoman army. Was it the red color that inspired their bravery? This might provide a perfect argument for any senator supporting this view. Then Charles thought of helmets. His eyes lit up, and he asked Gallieri, "General, if changing uniforms is too sensitive to be included in wartime procurement regulations, what about issuing helmets?" "Helmet?" Gallieri looked at Charles, puzzled. You think it's useful. Helmets were rarely issued at this time. People believed they couldn't stop bullets, therefore they were not only useless but also a waste of resources and an added burden on soldiers. But this idea was clearly wrong. Of course it's useful, General, Charles replied. I have first-hand experience on the battlefield. What wounds soldiers on the battlefield isn't just bullets, but also shrapnel and even rocks kicked up by artillery shells. In fact, the helmet's function was more than that, it could truly stop bullets. Unless a bullet hit the center of the helmet, due to the helmet's curved surface, most would deflect, just like artillery shells ricocheting off the sloped armor of a tank. Galleri considered for a moment and said, if that's what you're thinking, you can try it. Not changing the cap isn't really a matter of changing uniforms. You can produce a trial batch and see how the soldiers and the battlefield react. If it really works, the council can't stop it. If it has proven effective, and someone tries to stop it, it's no use telling everyone they want to kill the soldiers on the front lines. Charles confidently replied, yes, General. Chapter 329 The Feeling of the Battlefield. Back at his seat, Charles immediately began sketching the Franco-Austrian helmet. There's a story about the French helmet. During a heavy German artillery barrage, a cook accidentally placed a metal pot on his head, sustaining only minor injuries, while many others were seriously wounded or killed by the dense shrapnel and stones. General Adrien of the French army, deeply inspired by this incident, ordered the military industry to develop a metal helmet for the troops, hence the name Adrien helmet for the standard French helmet. The image above shows the Franco-Austrian helmet, considered the ancestor of modern military helmets. This order, of course, went to Steed. After all, Charles didn't have to do anything or worry about anything, yet he would receive half the profits. It was practically Steed working for Charles, with Charles only needing to provide the ideas. The meeting took place at dinner time, still at the Ritz Hotel, but not in a conference room but in the restaurant. Dominic was also present. Steed sat at the head of the table, with Charles and Dominic facing each other at the next level. The spotless white tablecloth and the elegantly simple crystal chandelier overhead illuminated the vast dining room as if it were daytime. This is for your triumphant return, Colonel. Steed looked at Charles with admiration. He genuinely admired Charles's courage. As a capitalist, he knew the biggest difference between the rich and the poor. The poor lived in poverty, feeling they were just wasted lives or yearning for success, so going to the battlefield was normal. The rich had a life to enjoy. If they died, everything they had earned through hard work would be meaningless. Charles, being one of the wealthy, had volunteered to go to the front lines, something many hadn't expected. Seeing Charles's slight hesitation towards the waiters standing on either side, Steed explained, "Don't worry, Colonel. Everyone who enters the dining room is one of my men." Charles was satisfied with Steed's arrangement, but then he glanced at the table: steak, red wine, caviar, and some fruit. Charles was somewhat disappointed. The wealthy French ate the same things, only with a supposedly higher standard. For example, the steak had to be Australian ribeye, the wine had to be from a specific year, and the caviar had to be from cavia sturgeon, and so on. Charles didn't care much for these things, he was rather oblivious to food. The tastes might differ, but it wasn't worth being so particular. Dominic turned the corner of the table and poured Charles a glass of red wine, asking with some skepticism, "Is what they were saying true? You were fighting the enemy with a rifle on the battlefield?" "Yes," Charles nodded. "I had to do it. There was a severe shortage of troops, the defenses might collapse without my rifle." Steed, sitting at the head of the table, raised his glass to Charles, praising, "A heroic act, Colonel." Charles, however, didn't think so. This had become commonplace during World War I, even though it was less than a year since the war began. Dominic looked at Charles with a complicated expression and asked cautiously, "How do you feel, Colonel?" Charles was taken aback, not understanding what Dominic was asking. But he soon understood. Dominic loved guns and shooting, but he might never experience a battlefield, and of course, he could never point a gun at a living person and pull the trigger. Guns were invented for war, to kill the enemy, but Dominic could only shoot at targets at the shooting range. "You won't like it," Charles replied expressionlessly. "If you're close, you can even see the pain of their souls leaving their bodies in their eyes. You'll empathize, you'll unconsciously think about what it would be like if you were shot, even, you'll feel cruel," Dominic interjected. "Yes," Charles replied. Returning from the battlefield, he felt his mindset had changed. It had nothing to do with suffering, but everything to do with killing the enemy. Even though it was the enemy he killed, there was still a difference between having killed them and not having killed them. Charles truly felt the fragility of life. After that, things he previously considered cruel now seemed trivial. Stead glanced at the thoughtful Dominic and smiled, saying, "People didn't expect the colonel to do this. Now they can shut up. Even the congressman can't find fault with the colonel's heroic actions." Stead saw business opportunity, a huge one. Charles had been to the battlefield, while the congressmen and capitalists hadn't. If any equipment disputes arose later, such as whether to use Charles's or Schneider's equipment, Charles's actions could serve as a publicity stunt. Charles had been to the battlefield, he understood war better than you, he knew what the battlefield needed. Perhaps this was Charles's purpose in risking his life on the battlefield, Stead thought. After a hearty meal, Charles took out a sketch of a steel helmet from his bag and handed it to Stead. "We can produce a trial batch, about 10,000. Charles had a reason for limiting the number to 10,000. At that time, military units were relatively large, with 1 division, 2 brigades, and 4 regiments. A division typically had over 10,000 or even 20,000 soldiers. If 20,000 helmets were produced, 1 for each soldier, there would be no comparison, and the difference between having and not having would be imperceptible. However, with only 10,000 helmets available, only a portion could be issued. The same unit fighting in the same environment, experiencing roughly the same intensity of German artillery fire, would immediately demonstrate the difference if helmet wearing resulted in lower casualties. Stead hadn't initially paid much attention to the sketch, it was just a helmet, nothing special. But then, his eyes widened instantly, and he looked up at Charles, asking, "You mean, if it works, it will become the standard helmet for the troops?" Charles calmly hummed in agreement. Stead was immediately overjoyed. This was a huge business opportunity. France had over 1 million soldiers. If every soldier needed one, that would be over 1 million. Moreover, helmets are consumables, they could be lost, damaged, or rusted on the battlefield. Add to that the need for each of the new recruits, and the number would far exceed 1 million. "We must be careful," Charles cautioned. "You know what will happen if the first batch is unpopular or doesn't work." "Of course, Colonel," Stead nodded hastily. "Don't worry, I'll get it right." After a few seconds of thought, Stead offered his direction. "We should reduce the weight as much as possible while maintaining strength, so we should use high-strength steel." Chapter 330 The deployment of the Chaza light machine gun. After having the waiter clear away the plates and bring out dessert and fruit, Stead ate as he spoke. They're already planning to deploy light machine guns. The first batch is estimated to be at least 10,000, sent to the Gallipoli battlefield. At this point, Stead glanced at Charles, secretly observing his reaction. In the past, Charles would have hesitated. Sending these malfunctioning machine guns to Gallipoli would inevitably cause a series of accidents, resulting in unnecessary casualties for the troops, something Charles wouldn't allow. But now, Charles simply gave a calm hum, as if he hadn't heard, continuing to fork up pieces of apple in front of him. It was an apple season. The reason they were still available was because they were preserved in industrial refrigerators. Of course, this was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. The image above shows the first household refrigerator with an electric compressor, invented in 1923. The refrigerator principle was first invented in 1834, but for a long time it remained in industrial use and failed to become widespread in households. Seeing that Charles hadn't responded, Dominic looked at him questioningly and asked, "Shouldn't we rush to launch our machine gun?" Charles replied coldly, "We can wait a bit longer, now is not the time." But Dominic's expression became tense. It might have serious problems. "When we designed this machine gun, we hoped it would be used in France, but now they intend to use it in Gallipoli." The French battlefield was mostly inland, while Gallipoli is a peninsula, a place with high salinity and humidity. Even without sand getting in, the Chassaigne-style magazine might have tiny salt crystals crystallizing, and it would also rust more easily in that environment. These factors would all lead to malfunctions, and more malfunctions. "Gallipoli really needs light machine guns," Charles answered evasively. "Heavy machine guns are too cumbersome and require precious fresh water for cooling." This was based on Charles's combat experience. Sometimes soldiers had no water to drink, but they had to save it for heavy machine guns. Using seawater for cooling would present a series of problems. It's corrosive to metals, causing them to rust, and the evaporation of seawater would leave behind large amounts of salt crystals. "It's not a question of need, Colonel," Dominic emphasized. "We also have light machine guns, far superior in quality to the Chochet. We've already produced 30,000 of them, enough for the Gallipoli battlefield. Dominic's implication was that if they supplied Gallipoli with light machine guns now, many fewer people might die. Steed smiled, answering the question on behalf of Charles. Colonel, you're right, Dominic, without comparison, there's no difference. We should first let people know how terrible the Chochet machine gun is, so they can indirectly understand how good ours is. Then, we can truly say we've defeated our opponent. Dominic looked at Steed in shock, then turned to Charles, his expression one of disbelief. It was normal for Steed to think this way. He only cared about money, profit, and his own business. But Charles wasn't like that. Charles didn't answer, which was tantamount to acquiescence. This is only one reason. At that time, there was no light machine gun but a great need for them. Although the Chochet was riddled with malfunctions, due to the large demand on the battlefield, it was urgently expanded in production over the next 2 years, producing a total of 260,000 units. To strike the enemy, of course, one should wait until urgent expansion rather than during this trial period. Dominic waited a while for Charles to reply, his eyes gradually showing disappointment, his tone laced with sarcasm. You've really become cruel, Colonel. You've lived up to your combat experience. Steed glared at Dominic reproachfully. Are you talking about the soldiers from Gallipoli? They were Australians, Dominic, and New Zealanders, British, and Africans. It has nothing to do with us, Dominic. The only French Army 105th Infantry Regiment has already been withdrawn, Dominic retorted. But they are lives too, Father. Steed's face darkened, and he asked, so, is it our responsibility for them to kill each other on the battlefield? Did we start the war? Or did we send our warships and troops? We were just selling equipment. Your anger seems to be directed at the wrong person. Dominic didn't refute, but his eyes were filled with anger as he continued a silent protest, and the restaurant fell into an awkward silence. Steed gave Charles an apologetic wry smile. I'm very sorry, Colonel. I hope this hasn't caused you any trouble. No, of course not, Charles replied, turning to Dominic and asking calmly, what's it called? I mean the machine gun we produce. It's called the St. Etienne II machine gun, Dominic answered. Charles raised an eyebrow. A good name, and a smart move. This could build momentum for the St. Etienne Armory. Once this machine gun was a great success on the battlefield, the people and soldiers wouldn't recognize the machine itself, but rather the St. Etienne Armory. What if I gave you the decision-making power? Charles asked again. What? Dominic was taken aback. You decide when to deploy the machine gun, Charles said firmly. I'm serious, of course I'll roll it out right now, Dominic said, his eyes regaining hope. Do you think they'll definitely choose something better? Charles asked again, as if he saw his younger self in him. Dominic paused, seemingly understanding the problem. Even if the St. Etienne Armory were to introduce a machine gun now, it would likely not be approved or accepted by the council. The St. Etienne Armory was no longer what it used to be. Its influence was being eroded by other capitalists. We can include it in the wartime procurement regulations, Dominic said. The same goes for my tanks, Charles replied. Do you know why I didn't include the Char A1 tank in the wartime procurement regulations? Dominic was speechless. He knew the reason, everyone knew it. Back then, the Char A1 tank had virtually no chance of defeating its competitors in the wartime procurement regulations. It could only prove itself on the battlefield. The current situation seemed similar. It wasn't about who was better, but about who had more power and influence. I bet, Charles continued, that if you introduced the machine gun now, it will likely be more widely adopted and save more lives than if you introduce it later. How is that possible? Dominic retorted. Wouldn't introducing the machine gun later require approval from Parliament and wartime regulations? Of course it would, Charles replied, but it also carries the advantage of actual combat. The French people and military already know that our machine gun is superior. If Parliament doesn't approve it, do you know what will happen? Marches, demonstrations, strikes, even military boycotts. Dominic then realized that Charles was using public pressure to force Parliament to accept the St. Etienne II machine gun. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 331 Retreating to Advance. No other way, Dominic's eyes showed a hint of helplessness. Unless you can think of something, Charles replied. Charles had tried before, but it was a systemic problem, not something an individual could challenge. Unless he could take control of the government with the army and forcibly dissolve parliament. Steed remained silent throughout. In his view, these things were not worth discussing at all, and Dominic was just being unreasonable. Businessmen should do their business. Whether more or fewer people died on the Gallipoli battlefield was a matter for the government and the military to consider. Steed swallowed the last bite of cream cake, wiped his mouth with a napkin, took it off and threw it on the table, signaling the waiter beside him to clear away the food. Regarding the issue of changing military uniforms, Steed said, "We will strive to get Parliament to pass it as soon as possible. I think it has a good chance." Really? Charles was somewhat surprised. "Yes," Steed nodded approvingly. "Your speech and answers during the questioning were excellent. I think you at least convinced the Workers' International France branch." Workers' International France branch. Charles heard this name for the first time. "Yes," Steed explained, "it's the name of a party. Although it doesn't have much influence in Parliament, it's neither left nor right." Then he is, Charles had already guessed. As the name suggested, it was likely a political party organized by workers. "Sure enough," Steed replied, "they are the Workers' Union, the kernel. The main body of this party is workers. They emphasize protecting the interests of laborers, advocate for pragmatic economic policies, and externally, uphold French independence and oppose the encroachment of foreign capital on France." Then Steed asked, "Remember the member of Parliament who asked the question? The one who said that red would motivate soldiers to charge rather than surrender?" Charles nodded. "His name is Gaspard," Steed said. "The leader of the Workers' International. They usually don't care much about parliamentary issues because they don't really concern them. But they seem to be showing support for you, and many left-wing capitalists don't care about the uniform issue, so we are very likely to pass." Charles vaguely remembered him. He was a middle-aged man with a beard. Although Charles found his words laughable, he was the only member of Parliament who didn't try to trap Charles. It could even be said that his question reminded Charles that this wasn't just about changing uniforms, but about French tactical theory. It was at that moment that Parliament suddenly shifted the focus of the debate to tactical theory in Charles's favor. Charles smiled slightly. Interesting. Was he intentionally asking a question to subtly help Charles? Steed continued, "I think the greater danger seems to be Wells's unclear stance." Charles hummed in agreement. Charles understood Wells. He wanted to stand on Charles's side, but Steele had too much influence on the shipyard, and he dared not easily offend the Schneider Group. Or rather, Wells was doing this intentionally, maintaining good relations between Schneider and Charles, and benefiting from both sides. "There are no permanent friends, only permanent interests," Charles repeatedly reminded himself. Even though he and Tycoon were comrades in arms, Wells was ultimately a businessman. He had to consider his own shipyard. Perhaps there was only one way to change this situation: own his own steel mill. Only then did Charles realize how important steel was. It wasn't just a matter of money, but also a matter of power and influence. Steed advised, "If possible, you'd better confirm with Mr. Wells." "No," Charles shook his head, "no need." "Do you think Wells will support us?" Steed asked doubtfully. Charles shook his head again. "He'll most likely abstain," Steed agreed. He thought so too. Abstaining meant avoiding offending anyone. The problem was that Wells' abstention could very well prevent the proposal from passing. "I actually hope Parliament rejects this proposal, rather than passes it," Charles said. Steed looked stunned. Dominic, who hadn't been concerned, was deep in thought, seemingly considering a way to implement machine guns. Hearing Charles's words, he looked up at him in confusion. A moment later, Dominic suddenly understood. "Like machine guns?" Reminded by Dominic, Steed exclaimed, "A strategic retreat? Good idea, Colonel." Charles was indeed using a strategic retreat. The call to change uniforms wasn't just Charles's, it was the Army's sentiment. Many soldiers on the front lines were already deeply resentful of the Red Army trousers and caps, and Charles was simply speaking out for them. If the House of Representatives passed Charles's proposal, it would alleviate pressure and give soldiers an expectation: just wait a little longer, they might change their uniform soon, and Congress had made the right decision. Then would come the back and forth between the Senate and the House, and by the time the decision was finally made, many innocent soldiers would have been killed or wounded on the front lines. But if Congress didn't pass it, the pressure would explode instantly, and Congress would face a public backlash, a warning from Charles, in a sense. Steed's eyes gleamed with excitement. It seemed that changing uniforms was inevitable, and no one could stop it. Every soldier's uniform would need to be replaced. This was similar to helmets, even more costly. Now, shouldn't they acquire some textile and garment factories to prepare? Charles kept a low profile regarding the uniform change. The military's official newspaper, the Merit Daily, didn't mention the uniform change at all, focusing instead on the developments in the Gallipoli campaign. The Le Petit Journal offered only a lukewarm commentary on Charles's speech in Parliament. While other newspapers reported on it, almost everyone focused on the correctness of the tactical theory. I believe the offensive theory is correct. France has always fought according to this theory. If it were wrong, France might not exist anymore. Wasn't Paris captured under the offensive theory? It almost fell again not long ago. Then it must be the defensive theory. Pétain used it to achieve victory time and time again on the front lines. If we're talking about victories, who can compare to Charles? Charles was satisfied with the situation. He worried that the members of Parliament would notice the seriousness of the uniform change issue. It was no exaggeration to say that it was like a dam about to collapse. On the surface, it seemed harmless. The soldiers had worn these uniforms for so many years without any problems, so what difference would it make if they continued? But these high-ranking members of Parliament, with almost no contact with the lower classes, certainly couldn't imagine that such a small matter could potentially trigger a riot. Chapter 332 Gas Warfare. Inside the officers' club, Lucia turned off the incandescent bulbs, leaving only a few low-wattage colored lights, instantly creating a dim and hazy atmosphere. Soon, officers entered in twos and threes, ordered drinks, and discussed topics of interest. To the strains of a listless piano, Lucia mechanically wielded the cocktail shaker, poured the prepared drink into a glass, rimmed it with half a lemon, and pushed it towards the officer at the bar. The officer stared at the glass in astonishment, looking up at Lucia. "But I ordered a Bloody Mary, Lucia." Lucia immediately realized her mistake and quickly replied, "I'm so sorry, Major, I made it for you." The Major hesitated for a moment, then understandingly replied, "No, it's all right. I suddenly felt like trying a Margaret. This one will do." Lucia was Charles's girlfriend, a fact known to the officers, hence their politeness. Even the guy who used to make inappropriate jokes about Lucia had toned it down considerably, after he'd been beaten black and blue by a group of officers who idolized Charles. "What's wrong, Lucia?" Gerald asked. "Do you need to go back and rest?" "No, nothing." Lucia shook her head, looking troubled. "Just didn't sleep well." But Lucia was still agitated, her gaze frequently drifting towards the club entrance, as if waiting for someone. Finally, a familiar figure came into Lucia's view. Lucia was initially delighted, but then her face darkened. She frowned, her face expressionless, pretending not to see him as she continued mixing her drink. "A coffee," Charles called towards the bar, finding a secluded corner to sit down. Seeing Lucia's indifference, Gerald gave a wry smile and took the cocktail shaker from her hand. "Go on, weren't you waiting for him?" "No, Gerald," Lucia quickly denied. "I wasn't." "All right," Gerald laughed. "So, you're not going to keep him waiting there, are you?" Lucia glanced helplessly in Charles's direction. He wasn't just her boyfriend, but also a guest at the club, and even her boss. What could she do? It wasn't until Lucia slammed the coffee down in front of Charles with a crisp sound that Charles noticed something was wrong with Lucia's expression. "What happened?" Charles asked. Charles's innocent expression only fueled Lucia's anger. He hadn't even realized he'd done something wrong. "Do I need to remind you, Colonel?" Lucia sat down opposite Charles without ceremony, her eyes burning with anger. "If a certain lady is your girlfriend, shouldn't you say goodbye to her before going to the battlefield?" "That's a military secret, Lucia," Charles replied. "I can't tell anyone." It was an excuse. There were reporters taking pictures at the port when the 105th Infantry Regiment departed, but it couldn't deny it. "All right," Lucia continued, "then, after you return from the battlefield, shouldn't you go to see her as soon as possible?" Charles nodded calmly. "I'll be more careful in the future." Lucia was disappointed. She had thought Charles would coax her or offer a small gift as an apology, but nothing came of it. In his mind, this was probably purely work, a mission, nothing more, Lucia thought, a bitter feeling rising in her heart. At that moment, Lucia suddenly realized that the problem was precisely with herself. She had uncontrollably let her personal feelings interfere. Thinking it over, Lucia tried to calm herself down, her tone regaining its composure. "I'm sorry, Colonel, I was too harsh." "No, you're right." Charles replied. I do need to put more effort into making my act more convincing in the future. These words were like a steel needle, deeply piercing Lucia's heart, causing her to be speechless with pain. Charles, however, asked expressionlessly, what has Greevy been up to lately? No, Colonel, Lucia said bitterly. Greevy seems to have sensed something and hasn't done anything during this time. Charles frowned. Sensed what? Perhaps Liam had slipped up. His contact with the Pitot Armory under Steed's close surveillance was bound to be strange. This might fool the Pitot Armory and Schneider, but it wouldn't fool Greevy. This cunning fox, Charles cursed inwardly. We have intelligence about Ypres. However, Lucia hesitated. However, what? Charles asked. We're not entirely sure, Colonel, Lucia said hesitantly. The Germans seem to be making some moves in the Ypres direction. In a place called Brut, they've sealed off and massacred dozens of families, but we can't find any bodies. If there are no bodies, how can you be sure it was a massacre? Charles asked, puzzled. Because we found many animals poisoned, Lucia explained. The plants have withered too, but we don't know what it is. Charles stared at Lucia in shock. Poison gas. The gas warfare of World War I began in Ypres, and its initial use caused over 10,000 Allied casualties. Charles had completely forgotten about it. You know what it is? Lucia asked, noticing Charles's sudden realization. Charles hesitated. He couldn't tell Lucia directly what it was. It was a top German secret, unknown to everyone globally, including British intelligence. If Charles knew, he would have to explain his source, otherwise he would be a German spy. After a moment's thought, Charles replied uncertainly, I don't know either, but if nearby animals and plants have been poisoned, could we guess it's a deadly gas? That's what we're thinking too. Lucia nodded. Its range does indeed look like some kind of poisonous gas. But does such a thing really exist? If so, why would the Germans use it in Brut Village? Their target might not be Brut Village. Lucia, Charles's expression turned serious. If I'm not mistaken, they're likely using it on the battlefield. Lucia's eyes widened instantly. Used on the battlefield? You mean? Charles nodded. Think about it. The Germans aren't doing well on the main battlefield. They're blockaded at sea. The Gallipoli campaign is on the verge of failure, and they're stretched thin by their eastern and western defenses. They can only hope to find an unconventional method. Charles's analysis made even more sense to Lucia. And Brut Village might just be a German experiment. Yes, Charles replied. They weren't sure if the gas would work in Ypres climate, so they did it. And its success means, Lucia stared at Charles in horror, it means the Germans might soon use gas on the Ypres defenses. Chapter 333 Top Secret. Everything was deduced by Charles and Lucia based on their analysis of the village of Brut. The Lady in White was an intelligence agency originating in Belgium, and Ypres was a town in Belgium. It was perfectly reasonable for Lucia to know and analyze this. One day, if anyone were to suspect Charles because of this, the Lady in White, and even many Belgians who had witnessed the events in Brut, could testify for him. Of course, Charles didn't need to go through the trouble of proving his innocence at the moment. He immediately returned to headquarters and informed Gallieni of the intelligence and speculation. Gallieni actually knew that Charles had an intelligence network in Belgium. Although Charles kept it a secret from everyone, many people knew that because Charles had saved Belgium, the Belgians had spontaneously organized an intelligence agency to pledge their loyalty to him. After listening to Charles's analysis, Gallieni found it reasonable. He immediately sent the intelligence to General Headquarters, but after considering it for a while, he was still uneasy and ordered his staff to forward another copy of the intelligence to Army Group North Headquarters. During World War I, the French forces were divided into 4 army groups: Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group East, and Army Group Reserve. Army Group North's combat missions were primarily concentrated in the northern section of the defensive line, and its commander was concurrently held by French Deputy Commander-in-Chief Foch. The headquarters was located in the small town of Varnet near Cambrai. This was Foch's style. He didn't expose his headquarters to public view, believing it was detrimental to offensive operations. During the period when Germany and Britain were fighting on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the French defenses experienced a period of vulnerability. Both sides seemed to have a tacit understanding not to launch large-scale offensives. The Germans needed to transport scarce supplies to the Ottoman Empire to reinforce their fighting, leaving them with no spare capacity for a large-scale offensive. France, on the other hand, was observing the situation on the Gallipoli Peninsula. If it achieved a decisive victory, a frontal offensive would be largely unnecessary. However, Foch would occasionally organize regimental-level attacks, believing this would maintain troop morale. That day, Foch chose a sunny window, sat in a rocking chair, and read the newspaper while basking in the sun. Foch didn't often read newspapers. His staff reported directly to him, which he considered more concise and time-saving. But these past 2 days were different, because it carried Charles's speech in Parliament. I don't think Foch's theory of offense is correct, nor do I agree with Paytain's theory of defense. The correct approach should be to sometimes attack and sometimes defend. We cannot simplify complex battlefield problems, much less hope to win by using a single, simplistic, and one-sided theory. After reading it, Foch smiled slightly, folded the newspaper, and tossed it onto the desk beside him. He gently rocked the chair back and forth, muttering an assessment. If the theory of offense is wrong, then what were the Allies doing on the Gallipoli Peninsula? Wasn't Charles, that great military strategist, launching an offensive? This is one of the reasons why the theory of offense was so prevalent and regarded as an unchallengeable tactical theory by France. All examples of victory achieved through offense could serve as arguments for the theory of offense, and almost all victories were achieved through offense. For example, Paris was occupied by Germany in the Franco-German War. This could indeed be seen as a failure of French tactics, but at the same time, it could also be seen as the German army adopting the theory of offense, and adopting it more resolutely, bravely, and effectively than the French army, thus achieving victory. Therefore, whether France, using this theory, won or lost on the battlefield, it was not the fault of the theory of offense, but rather the soldiers' lack of faith in it. Foch was becoming sleepy in the lazy sunlight when his staff officer Marini stepped forward to report, "General, a telegram from the City Defense Command concerns Charles." Foch suddenly opened his eyes. Marini handed over the telegram with his only remaining hand, saying, "Galen says that Charles believes the Germans are likely to use poison gas to attack us soon." Poison gas. Foch took the telegram from Marini, glanced at it, and replied curtly, "Top secret." "Yes, General." Those two words meant the information had to be sealed off. It couldn't leave command. Then, Marini asked doubtfully, "General, do you also think this is possible? The Germans will use poison gas to attack us?" "No." Foch shook his head, then gave his assessment. "It's just speculation without any evidence, nothing more. We certainly can't fight based on speculation, even though it was Charles who made that speculation." Marini nodded in agreement. If every speculation was taken seriously, the most likely outcome would be soldiers dying from exhaustion. Then, a look of doubt appeared on Marini's face. If that were the case, why did Foch classify it as top secret? Foch seemed to see through Marini's thoughts. Instead of answering, he asked, "If this intelligence reaches the troops, what do you think the result will be?" Marini instantly understood. The soldiers would be terrified by the unknown poison gas, the troops would be filled with panic, and the soldiers would be suspicious and unwilling to fight. This was one of the core tenets of Foch's offensive theory, to maintain high morale at all times and make the soldiers believe they were on the verge of victory. Foch yawned, handed the telegram back to Marini, and said casually, "You know how to reply." "Yes, General." Marini took the telegram and headed to the communications room. "We are verifying this information. Please keep it confidential." This was the reply from the Northern Army Group to the City Defense Command, while the general headquarters at Joffre simply disappeared without a trace. Charles was somewhat surprised by this result. This was a gas warfare operation, and all the warning he issued received was this insignificant sentence? But then he thought it seemed normal. At this time, there was no precedent for poison gas warfare. Everyone was puzzled and didn't even believe it existed, just like no one believed tanks existed before they were invented. More importantly, if word got out about poison gas warfare, it could potentially shake morale, and Charles was the source. They even had grounds to court-martial Charles. Gallieri shook his head helplessly. "They don't seem to believe you, Colonel." "Let's leave it at that." Clearly, Gallieri also saw the unfavorable side of this intelligence. If poison gas didn't exist, it would actually have a negative impact on the Allied powers. But Charles was certain it existed and would soon appear on the battlefield. Chapter 334 French Dignity. 2 days later, the uniform controversy erupted. After 3 days of discussion, the Chamber of Deputies ultimately voted against the bill to replace military uniforms. Many members were surprised by the result. They thought the bill would pass, as it wasn't a major issue, affecting only a small portion of the clothing factories' interests, and only a fraction of those interests, The uniforms piling up in warehouses became useless. But it was ultimately rejected. Because it was a secret ballot, no one knew who had voted against it, only finding it somewhat strange. Even so, the members didn't take it to heart. It was just a matter of changing uniforms, nothing too significant. The news barely left Parliament before the public was largely unmoved, many dismissing it as a rumor. The next day, major newspapers ran headlines like, "The Chamber of Deputies voted against Charles's proposal. Members firmly believe that military uniforms represent the dignity of France and cannot be replaced. Does this mean the offensive theory remains unshakable, or is Parliament hinting at something to Charles?" The previously calm France was instantly ignited. The loudest voices came from the soldiers fighting on the front lines. After all, it concerned their lives, and they protested again and again. What right do those who don't fight have to decide what uniforms the soldiers fighting on the battlefield wear? If one day they think we should fight the enemy with kitchen knives or sticks, should we obey? Do those guys know what French dignity is? It's only about winning battles, not what uniforms we wear. The complaints of the frontline soldiers quickly influenced those at home, because they were all the soldiers' parents or siblings. That afternoon, people took to the streets, holding banners and waving small flags to protest. "We support Charles, he is the officer who understands war. Change the uniform. Victory is dignity, protecting the lives of soldiers is victory." Charles was leaving the city's defense headquarters, his destination being the police training base. His car had only been driving for a few minutes when he unexpectedly ran into a protest march. The streets and alleys were completely blocked by a sea of people, and passing cars could only detour or stop on the side of the road to wait for the procession to pass. The demonstrators were actually deliberately blocking traffic, which would trigger a larger chain reaction, making the government and parliament realize the seriousness of the situation and give it sufficient attention. Suddenly, someone noticed Laurent's car and spotted Charles in the back seat. He exclaimed, "That's Charles. Charles is here." The crowd cheered, shouting Charles's name and pushing forward to shake his hand. "We support you, Colonel. We believe you are right. Only you would consider the lives of the soldiers on the front lines. Lead us. We are willing to follow you in resisting Parliament." Charles was almost startled by the last sentence. Resist Parliament? That would make him a target of public criticism, and even Steed, whom he had just won over, might become an enemy. Charles pretended not to hear and waved to them with a friendly smile. Laurent, understanding their needs, honked his horn and started the car, shouting, "Make way, gentlemen, the colonel has a mission." The people readily made way for Charles, waving and cheering as his car passed. Cars tried to follow Charles's vehicle, but were immediately blocked by the surging crowd. The procession was long, numbering at least tens of thousands, so long that it took the car more than 10 minutes to move away from the clamor. Laurent breathed a sigh of relief and remarked, "They are all your supporters, Colonel. They support changing military uniforms." "Laurent," Charles corrected. "On the surface, that's true," Laurent replied calmly. On the surface, Charles looked at Laurent questioningly. Laurent tilted his head slightly, glanced at Charles in the rearview mirror, and nodded. "You can think of it this way, if it weren't you who raised the issue of changing military uniforms, but someone else, there wouldn't be a march of this scale. It might not even cause a ripple." Charles felt that Laurent's words made sense. The spontaneous organization of such a large march in such a short time couldn't be achieved simply by changing military uniforms. It required a core force, a spiritual leader. And Charles was very likely that force, their spiritual leader, even though Charles hadn't done or said anything except for his protests in Parliament. The car slowly drove into the police training base. The scene that came into view filled Charles with a sense of relief. He saw the soldiers of the 105th Infantry Regiment still training methodically on the parade ground. That's how professional soldiers should be. Their mindset shouldn't be affected by external factors. But Charles quickly realized he was wrong. He discovered a group of men marching in formation on the parade ground without trousers. Some wore shorts, others nothing at all. April in Paris wasn't so cold anymore, they had the means to do so. The key point was that they were practicing with remarkable discipline under commands: forward, left turn, jog. Everyone was expressionless and serious, as if facing the enemy on a battlefield. Tigeny stood in front, watching the group, looking helpless, seemingly unable to do anything about it. Charles gestured for Laurent to stop the car next to Tigeny, jumped out, and asked, "What's going on?" Tigeny then noticed Charles, his furrowed brow relaxing as he replied, That's support for you, Colonel. Support for me, Charles asked, puzzled. Tidjany answered with only one word, Red Army trousers. Charles immediately understood. They were demonstrating their refusal to wear Red Army trousers through their actions. I gave them orders, Tidjany said, but do you know what they said? Charles shook his head slightly. Tidjany mimicked the soldier's tone. General, we believe that such a situation might arise on the battlefield, and in order not to reveal our position, we have to take off our conspicuous Red Army trousers. We are conducting targeted training, and we think it makes sense. Tidjany then spread his hands. Can you say they are wrong? If it were you, how would you answer them? This was a good idea, Charles thought to himself. They neither disobeyed orders nor did they express their stance. However, it wasn't very elegant. But what did elegance matter if it meant saving lives on the battlefield? That was perhaps what the soldiers were thinking. Soon, this method quickly spread throughout the army, and other units followed suit, even soldiers fighting on the front lines. For a time, France was filled with soldiers with bare bottoms. This is what they call French dignity, someone joked. Chapter 335 Gas Mask. Charles didn't take the uniform incident too seriously. He knew it would be resolved sooner or later, because it didn't significantly infringe on the interests of capitalists, yet it would provoke strong social backlash. Why not do them a favor? Moreover, it was predictable that changing uniforms wouldn't just pass, but would be put on the fast track. After all, members of parliament also needed public support to secure their positions. Therefore, Charles focused his energy on dealing with the gas warfare. Tidjany's command post was on the second floor of the office building. This four-story office building didn't exist originally. Before, the office area and the training building were integrated, because police training didn't require a separate, large, and clearly defined command post. After Tidjany arrived with the 105th Infantry Regiment, he immediately used his own funds to start construction. How can a training base be without a command post? Tidjany said, especially my command post. The building was completed while the 105th Infantry Regiment was still fighting in Gallipoli. Everything here was new and fully equipped: a lounge, a communications room, an operations department, a logistics department. Each department had its own telephone and radio. This regimental command post was even more luxurious than the city's defense headquarters in Galini. The command post was spotless, and the crackling firewood in the fireplace added warmth to the room. Tidjany made Charles a cup of instant coffee and brought it to him, then took one for himself. He frowned, took a sip, and complained, I'm worried I won't be able to adapt to the tastes on the battlefield. Tidjany was referring to the instant coffee, which he considered a sacrifice, unaware that many people at this time couldn't afford such processed instant coffee. We should make some preparations, Charles said. What? Tidjany looked up at Charles. You mean changing uniforms? This requires preparation. No, Tidjany, Charles replied. I mean the war. I think there will be new developments. Tidjany said. Oh, you mean Gallipoli? If they won at Gallipoli, the situation would indeed be different. Tidjany unconsciously glanced at the map on the wall. But Charles shook his head. No, I mean gas warfare. Gas warfare. Tidjany turned to Charles, looking blank. Charles explained the situation to Tidjany, emphasizing, although it's just speculation, if it comes true, our defenses will have a huge gap, and may even collapse. Charles wasn't actually worried about that. Historically, the Germans' use of gas warfare had indeed caused heavy casualties to the Allied powers, creating a massive gap in their defenses, 10 kilometers long and 7 kilometers deep. However, because the German army had to face two defensive lines simultaneously, from the east and west, only a very limited number of troops could penetrate through this gap, and they were ultimately stopped by the French reinforcements. What Charles was truly worried about was what would happen if the 105th Infantry Regiment, which had suffered over 70,000 Allied casualties in this battle, included Charles himself. I can't convince them, Charles said, taking a sip of coffee and placing it back on the tray, his tone tinged with helplessness. Nobody believes it's true. They're even worried my words will shake morale. Tidjany's tone was very certain. They're wrong. If you believe it, then it certainly is. Charles was somewhat surprised. He thought Tidjany would at least ask a few questions, such as whether there was further investigation or other supporting intelligence, but he asked nothing. Tidjany's only question was, how should we prepare? I mean, if the enemy releases poison gas, we might not be able to do anything. They shouldn't doubt Charles, Tidjany thought, because Charles had never been wrong. Everything Charles said and did had proven correct in hindsight. Those fools always thought they were smarter than Charles. Charles paused, realizing he had prepared some arguments, such as we can take precautions and better safe than sorry, hoping to persuade Tycoon. But now, none of it mattered. Charles shrugged, ignoring them, and reached for his briefcase, opening it to pull out a gas mask and handing it to Tycoon. It was a prototype Charles had Steed produce. It wasn't complex, simply a device worn on the face to breathe air through a filter canister, utterly devoid of technology. Charles had also avoided a problem. The earliest gas filters invented during World War I contained cotton soaked in sodium carbonate solution, which reacted with chlorine gas to absorb it. But if he used this method, Charles would have to answer a question. It was only effective against chlorine. How could he know in advance that the Germans were using chlorine gas and produce a gas mask specifically designed for it? Therefore, Charles used more advanced activated carbon particles, effective against all poisonous gases and allowing for easier breathing. "What's this?" Tycoon asked curiously, fiddling with it in his hand. "A gas mask." Charles took it back and put it on his head, looking at Tycoon through the two-eye windows. Tycoon found it amusing and tried it on himself, then suddenly realized something, taking it off and looking at Charles with a shocked expression. "You mean, wearing this means we don't need to worry about the enemy's poison gas? Is this your new invention?" Charles nodded in acknowledgement. "This is what I meant by preparation. If we can't convince them, can't get them to prepare, the only ones who can prepare are the 105th Infantry Regiment." However, Tycoon wasn't interested in this. He was interested in the art of war. "Colonel," Tycoon interrupted Charles, "how did you come up with the idea of inventing this? Is it really effective?" Charles couldn't answer. The gas mask was invented because after the Germans used poison gas, people discovered that a large number of wild animals, including birds in the forest and even frogs and insects lurking in the ground, were not spared, except for wild boars. Scientists discovered through experiments that wild boars have an extremely sensitive sense of smell. When they smell a pungent odor, they habitually bury their noses in this oil and remain motionless, using oil particles to filter poisonous gases from the air. At this time, the Germans hadn't yet used poison gas, so this experiment was obviously impossible. Charles could only vaguely reply, "I just thought of it, I can't explain why." Tycoon laughed. "That's true, who can explain why?" Then his eyes lit up. "If it really works, and the Germans think we've already been poisoned to death in the field, then they'll be the ones who suffer." Chapter 336 Yellow-Green Fog. In mid-April, a gentle breeze blew through Ypres in the early morning, the damp sea air still carrying a chill. Inside the Allied defense line, most soldiers were still asleep, only a few sentries huddled in their trenches, yawning and keeping a watchful eye on the Germans. Suddenly, a yellowish-green smoke wall, taller than a man, rose from the no-man's land, drifting slowly towards the Allied defense line with the wind. Felix, on guard duty, rubbed his eyes, thinking his vision was playing tricks on him from not sleeping all night. After confirming several times, he turned to his comrade, who was dozing off against the trench with his rifle in his arms, and asked, "Klein, wake up, am I seeing things?" "Yellowish-green fog," Klein muttered, "you must be seeing things. The weather's been fine these past few days, there's no fog, it's real, right in front of us." Felix nudged Klein with his foot. "Get up and take a look." Klein frowned, seemingly displeased with Felix's actions. He had lived in this area since childhood and had never seen any yellowish-green fog. This must be a lame excuse Felix made up to wake him. However, when Klein peeked out, he indeed saw a yellowish-green fog rolling towards them like a tide, no more than 100 meters away. Klein exclaimed, "It doesn't look like fog. If it's not fog, then what is it?" Felix countered. "I don't know," Klein replied. "Perhaps we should report this to our superiors," Felix suggested. Before he could finish speaking, Felix smelled a pungent, strange odor. He couldn't help but cough, his eyes stung, and his throat felt like it was on fire. Klein experienced the same thing. Felix immediately realized this was the yellow-green fog. It had caused such a strong reaction even before it reached them. The word poison gas flashed into Felix's mind. He made a snap decision, pulling Klein along the trench and running. Klein shouted intermittently as they ran, "We need to notify the others." "It's too late," Felix replied. By the time they notified the others, everyone would be engulfed in the gas. They should notify the troops on the second line of defense to minimize casualties. As it turned out, Felix was right. Of the more than 3,000 men on the first line of defense, only a few dozen survived due to lack of preparation. Behind the second line of defense, thanks to timely warnings from sentries, casualties were much lower. Even so, the entire Allied forces in the Ypres salient, including the British 5th Army and the French 20th Army, numbering over 100,000, collapsed, leaving a 10-kilometer-wide gap in the defensive line. In this battle, the Germans released 6,000 canisters of chlorine gas, totaling 180,000 kilograms, causing 15,000 people to be poisoned, of whom 5,000 died. The German 26th Army followed the gas attack towards the gap, easily capturing the Allied positions with almost no resistance and advancing towards the Ypres-Comminges Canal. The image above shows a close-up of the gas release during World War I. Because chlorine is denser than air, it can remain at lower levels for a long time, maintaining a sustained lethal effect on the enemy. At the North Army Group headquarters, Foch, as usual, got up at 6 o'clock sharp. After a quick wash, he began his daily jog around the village. This was a habit Foch had maintained for many years. He believed that a strong physique was essential to ensuring the speed of the troops' advance. Although as a general he no longer needed to charge the enemy on the front lines, he should still do so, even if it only served as a demonstration. Foch usually ran for half an hour, but that day he had to stop. Just as he finished half a lap and was about to take a sip of water, Marini rushed towards Foch, shouting in a panic, "General, something's happened. You have to go back to headquarters immediately." Foch was quite dissatisfied with Marini's behavior. As a soldier, especially a staff officer at an army group headquarters, he should always remain calm. Marini didn't realize this. He ran up to Foch, reporting breathlessly, "Poison gas, General, it's poison gas." Foch gave a no, his tone tinged with displeasure. Charles brought up poison gas again. This guy was still going on and on. He had already warned him last time. This intelligence might have been deliberately leaked by the Germans to disrupt the morale of the Allied forces. However, Marini shook his head and replied, "No, General, it's the Germans. The Germans released poison gas." Foch, who was drinking water, choked. He coughed uncontrollably, his eyes filled with shock as he looked at Marini, asking with difficulty, "What, poison gas? Are you sure?" "Yes," Marini nodded heavily. "In Ypres, our army suffered heavy casualties and has retreated in large numbers." Charles is right, the Germans are indeed preparing for a gas attack. Foch could no longer remain calm. He threw down his water bottle and turned to run towards the command post. The news soon reached France, and Paris was instantly in an uproar. Everyone knew that the Germans were using poison gas on the battlefield. "This is an inhumane act. They cannot do this. This is not war. This is slaughter. They are simply demons, ruthless killers, executioners." At the time, Charles was on leave at home. He had many holidays during this period and had temporarily resumed his usual routine of taking a day off every 2 days. Gallieni accepted the offer because Charles needed rest after returning from the Gallipoli campaign, and Charles, preoccupied with personal matters, readily agreed. While sound asleep, a rapid knocking came at the door, followed by Laurent's shout, "Colonel, the general wants you back at headquarters immediately." Charles immediately realized it was urgent. This was the first time Laurent had personally come upstairs to knock instead of waking Charles through Joka. Charles vaguely guessed that the gas war had begun, only that could make Laurent so anxious. Sure enough, as Charles hurriedly dressed and went out, Laurent reported, pale-faced, "Gas, the Germans used gas." "You guessed right again." Charles gave a blank hum and led him downstairs. Joka and Camille were already waiting downstairs. They had heard some news and were now nervously watching Charles descend. Shouldn't Charles be sent back to the battlefield now? Camille thought, but she didn't say it aloud. She simply stepped forward and stopped Charles. "It's your holiday today, Charles." Camille's excuse was weak. "You should be resting at home." "It's all right, Mother," Charles replied. "I'm going to Paris, nowhere else, I promise." Chapter 337 The Neighbor's Plea. At the Paris garrison headquarters, the staff, who had been calm for some time, tensed up again. Everyone was busy contacting medical teams, reserves, vehicles, and even chemical experts. Large numbers of soldiers injured by the poison gas were stranded at the front lines and could not be transported back. Even if they would be beyond medical help. Note, damage caused by chlorine gas is irreversible. It actually reacts with the body's moisture to produce corrosive hydrochloric acid, burning the esophagus. trachea, and even internal organs. Even if one survives, recovery is difficult. Galleri sat at his desk, reading telegram after telegram, his brow furrowed. He regretted not listening to Charles. Charles had already issued a warning, but Galleri had been skeptical and therefore hadn't investigated further or made any preparations. When Charles entered the operations department, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and unanimously turned their expectant gazes to him. Galleri didn't say much, but opened the door and handed a telegram to Charles. Your intelligence is correct. This morning, the Germans released poison gas in Ypres, and the Ypres defenses have completely collapsed. Before Charles could reply, Galleri continued, currently, its casualties aren't too high. According to our intelligence, we estimate several thousand casualties. Several thousand casualties might be terrifying in modern times, but they were commonplace during World War I. However, Galleri changed his tone. The key point is that we have no means to counter it, so the entire defense line is in a state of panic, fearing that the Germans will use poison gas in their direction. Charles nodded in understanding. What's more terrifying about poison gas is its psychological impact on the soldiers. Death from just breathing it. How can it be avoided? If it can't be avoided, does it mean the war is already lost, and the Germans will occupy wherever they go? Should they surrender now? Because all resistance is meaningless, the Germans will ultimately win, and resistance will only increase casualties. Perhaps the Germans themselves didn't realize the immense psychological impact of chemical warfare on the Allies. They were more concerned with its lethality. And its lethality, in fact, disappointed the Germans, releasing 6,000 canisters of gas, totaling 180,000 kilograms, resulted in only 5,000 enemy deaths and 10,000 wounded or poisoned. Being wounded or poisoned didn't mean they were incapable of fighting. They could still easily pull the trigger and unleash volleys of bullets on German troops. If the Germans had correctly recognized the psychological threat posed by chemical warfare, they should have concentrated an army group at the breach and launched a large-scale infiltration while Allied morale was low. This would likely have led to the complete collapse of the Allied defenses, resulting in a completely different outcome for World War I. Do you know more about the chemical gas? Galleri asked. For example, what kind of substance it is, what its properties are, whether there are any methods of relief or treatment, etc. This wasn't just about treating the wounded, it was about stabilizing morale and even developing countermeasures. Charles remained sufficiently cautious about this. Sometimes, pretending not to know is harder than pretending not to know. The latter, if exposed, is at most a lie being revealed. The former, if it inadvertently reveals something, can only be explained as a German spy. I have no more information, General, Charles replied. All I know is a suspected German gas experiment. Galleri's eyes showed disappointment, but he also thought it was normal. The Germans would certainly keep it highly secret. At this moment, Fernand handed over a telegram from Army Group North. General Foch wants to know if Charles knows any more information. Galleri grunted in acknowledgement. Almost everyone in this situation would think of the whistleblower, Charles, and Foch was no exception. He should be regretting his actions now. However, the general staff remained silent. Joffre was still too proud. He probably felt this was more important than the lives of his soldiers, the safety of the lines, or even the safety of France. Just as Galleri was about to give Foch a negative answer, Charles stopped him, saying, although I don't know what it is, I might have a solution. General, what? Galleri looked at Charles in shock, and the staff officers in the command post also stopped what they were doing and turned their gazes to Charles. Galleri asked doubtfully, but you don't know what it is, how can you find a solution? Most people believe that dealing with poison gas required treating the symptoms, and of course, it was impossible to find an antidote if you didn't know what kind of poison it was. It's just a possibility, General, Charles explained. After suspecting the Germans would use poison gas, I made some preparations. With that, Charles returned to his position, took out a gas mask, and presented it to Galleri, explaining its features. Finally, Charles emphasized, I'm not sure if it will work, but something is better than nothing, Galleri said, conveying Charles's meaning. The situation is already at its worst. Any equipment and any method is worth trying. Yes, that's what I mean, Charles replied. Increase production immediately. Galleri glanced at the gas mask and said impatiently, we'll order as many as you have, at least it protects eyes. Galleri was confident, because it was equipment invented by Charles, and everything he invented had invariably proven highly effective. This time, Charles didn't leave without saying goodbye as before. He chose to go home. But it didn't really make much difference, because Charles couldn't say anything. When the car pulled into the town of Darvaz and stopped in front of his house, Charles was surprised to find his house crowded with neighbors, men and women, all talking loudly inside. As soon as the neighbors saw Charles's car, they rushed out to greet him. "It's Charles. Charles is back. Charles, can you think of a way? You must have a way. Save them." Charles didn't understand what the neighbors were talking about and walked into the house blankly. Djoka was busy greeting the neighbors, while Camille sat pale-faced on the sofa, looking troubled. She even wished Charles hadn't come back. "It's like this," Djoka explained. "Some people in our town are serving in the 20th Army." Charles suddenly realized the 20th Army was the unit stationed at Ypres that had been attacked with poison gas, and they were still holding the line. These neighbors must be their families. Sure enough, the neighbors pleaded all at once, some with tears still on their faces. "Remember Michael, Charles? He was your classmate, he was in the 20th Army, and Goldman. He was 2 years older than you, he used to skip school with you. Save them, Charles, you are only hope." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 338. That's Charles. To his neighbor's persistent requests, Charles could only offer a half-hearted reply, promising to do his best. Even so, the neighbors were incredibly grateful, as if Charles's promise guaranteed victory and the rescue of their sons from the lines. Only Charles knew that the battlefield was fraught with uncertainty. No one could guarantee victory, even with thorough preparation. Due to the urgency of the situation, Charles only stayed at home for half an hour before returning to the city's defense headquarters. The 105th Infantry Regiment, after a brief preparation, boarded a train and headed to the Ypres front. At this time, only 2 hours had passed since the Germans launched their gas attack. Because the police training base was located in the 12th arrondissement of Paris, though far from the city center, it was still within the city limits. Therefore, the 105th Infantry Regiment's movements were no secret. People knew immediately that the 105th Infantry Regiment had gone to the front. However, Charles employed a tactic. He didn't go with the troops, but instead entered and exited the city's defense headquarters under the watchful eyes of his fans, even spending some time speaking to the public to reassure them. Naturally, people were certain that Charles wouldn't personally go to the front lines this time, but would instead command from the city's garrison headquarters as usual. The French people had mixed reactions to the battle. Some were optimistic, but many more were pessimistic. "Look, Charles's troops are going. They're going to teach the Germans a lesson." But even if it's Charles's troops, what can they do? Are they immune to poison gas? Yes, sending Charles's troops seems unwise. Whether they're elite troops or not seems to make no difference in the face of poison gas. At the same time, people understood Charles's decision not to personally go to the battlefield. After all, poison gas was too dangerous, and a suitable countermeasure hadn't yet been found. However, what no one knew was that Charles secretly flew to Ypres that very night to join the 105th Infantry Regiment. Even Gallieni said, "You don't have to go personally, Colonel. People understand." Parliament doesn't even dare to suggest it. Indeed, if Parliament suggested Charles personally go to the battlefield at this time, it would almost be telling the world that they wanted to use the enemy to kill Charles. But Charles felt he had no choice but to go. Charles countered, "General, what will the soldiers of the 105th Infantry Regiment think if I don't go? They'll hold up their gas masks and say, 'Charles invented this thing, but he himself doesn't have confidence in it. Otherwise, why wouldn't he be with us?' They'll think the gas masks are just psychological comfort, a way to trick them into fighting the enemy in poison gas." This wasn't actually asking Charles to go to the battlefield, but it would create doubt about the gas masks. Once they doubted the gas masks, the 105th Infantry Regiment, like all frontline troops, would collapse and flee at the slightest sign of trouble. This was a tradition of European troops. If they felt their presence was meaningless or powerless to change the course of the battle, they would choose to desert. It was perfectly natural, not shameful. Gallieni wasn't unaware of this. He knew that the frontline troops, knowing Charles was fighting alongside them, would be greatly encouraged and quickly stabilize their lines to prevent a German breakthrough. But this was poison gas. After a moment's consideration, Gallieni nodded, "This seems to be good for you. The French people know you were with them when they were in the most danger and needed you most. They will remember that." "Yes, General," Charles replied. This was actually one of the reasons Charles requested to go to the battlefield personally. True character is revealed in times of crisis. When the entire Allied powers were gripped by panic, and the French military and civilians felt impending doom and even considered surrender, if Charles could go against the tide and single-handedly withstand the danger, his position in the hearts of the people would be irreplaceable. This would become Charles's greatest military and political capital, something even Foch could not challenge. Otherwise, his life was his own. Charles would not risk his life to fight against poison gas, even with a gas mask. Late at night, the Ypres airport, which should have been calm, was in chaos. Many seriously poisoned soldiers and civilians were waiting there for emergency transport to Paris for treatment. Since the Germans launched the gas attack, tens of thousands of wounded had been wounded in just 1 hour, causing Ypres' medical system to collapse instantly. More importantly, almost everyone, including doctors, was helpless against the symptoms of poisoning. Their only option was to try and send the wounded to Paris, hoping they would have a solution. However, Ypres was too far from Paris. The journey of over 400 kilometers by train could take more than 10 hours, which was practically tantamount to waiting to die. Therefore, some who had the means or high-ranking officers had no choice but to hire airplanes. At this moment, a two-seater Avro, guided by indicator lights, slowly landed at the airport. People cast curious glances at the plane. Should it be a Benova landing at this time? The image above shows the earliest civilian transport plane, the Benova, which began operation on January 1, 1914. It could only carry 2 people, a pilot and 1 passenger, and tickets were expensive, costing $5 per trip. The first ticket sold for a staggering $400. Before the plane had even come to a complete stop, several cars immediately approached, carrying heavily armed French soldiers, while police blew whistles to keep people behind a cordon. Someone shouted, "They must be escaping from here for some wealthy capitalist." The crowd erupted in chaos, yelling and charging at the police and soldiers blocking their way. But they quickly stopped. They saw the police and soldiers draw their pistols. "Don't come any closer," the lead guard, holding a revolver, cautiously pointed it at the ground, shouting a warning, "We'll shoot, I promise." People froze. This kind of thing only happened when workers protested for an 8-hour workday, and the government then deployed the army to suppress them. Then, someone whispered, "Is it a military secret?" The angry crowd suddenly understood. If it was a military secret, the soldiers' reaction was normal. Their actions had almost threatened national security. Then, everyone's eyes turned to the plane, wondering who it was taking away. Soon, they realized they were wrong. It wasn't taking anyone away, but bringing someone in. In the dim light, a slightly thin figure jumped from the cabin and, surrounded by guards, got into a car. Someone exclaimed, "My God, that's Charles. It's Charles. I recognize him." Everyone froze. Charles? He'd actually come to Ypres? At this time? After a long silence, someone finally said, "No, that's not Charles. You must be mistaken." The others understood and chimed in, "Yes, you must be mistaken. Charles couldn't possibly be here. Charles is in Paris. We didn't see anything." Chapter 339. That wasn't just a promise. Inside a tunnel used as a command post on the 43rd Division's defensive line of the French 20th Army, Captain Claude was arguing with Tigny under the light of a kerosene lamp, studying a map. Captain Claude was fortunate. When the Germans launched their gas attack, he and his troops had just completed 2 weeks on the second line of defense. At that time, the French front employed a rotation system, dividing troops into several groups. They would first be stationed and trained in the rear, then, after 2 weeks, be pushed forward layer by layer along the trenches until they had completed 2 weeks on the front lines before returning to the rear for rest, and so on. Today happened to be the rotation day. If the Germans had delayed their attack by even 1 day, Captain Claude's troops would have been the ones suffering massive gas casualties at the front. However, Captain Claude was also unfortunate. As one of the main initiators of the Christmas ceasefire, despite his numerous victories, he had never been promoted. Moreover, the most dangerous tasks were always assigned to Claude's 2nd Infantry Company. For example, this time, fearing the 105th Infantry Regiment was unfamiliar with the situation at the front, they sent Claude to stand guard at the forefront with the 105th Infantry Regiment. "We can't plan to hold out, General," Captain Claude argued. I know you're Charles's troops, and I know you won at Gallipoli, but this is different. This is poison gas. It's unlike any battle we're familiar with. I know, Captain, Tycoon said sarcastically, looking at Claude. We're here to solve the problem, Claude explained to the map. I have an idea, General. The Germans probably don't have any gas protection themselves. They won't attack immediately after releasing the gas. Then why don't we hide our forces on the flanks and rear, making the enemy think we've already retreated? By the time the Germans enter our positions, the gas will have dissipated, and I think that's a good opportunity for a counter-offensive. Tycoon looked at the captain with interest. Although his rank wasn't high, he had many ideas, far superior to those generals who only emphasized offense. Just then, a dark figure darted into the tunnel, his voice preceding his arrival. Why do you think the Germans didn't have any gas protection? Because their attack was very cautious, Captain Claude replied. They could have followed us and pressed their advantage, but they didn't. They only advanced 3.25 kilometers before stopping to dig trenches and build fortifications. The French army had retreated 5 or 6 kilometers in panic that day. The Germans could have advanced at least 2 kilometers more, or even more, but they didn't. The only explanation was that they themselves were highly skeptical of this new weapon, poison gas. They weren't sure how long it would last, how much damage it would cause, or even if it might poison them. Charles hummed in agreement with the middle-aged captain's assessment. The kerosene lamp gradually illuminated Charles's face. Claude stared wide-eyed at Charles, utterly shocked. Charles, it really is you? Charles looked at the middle-aged captain with a puzzled expression. You recognize me, of course, Colonel. Claude straightened up and answered, his voice sounding somewhat strange from excitement. Do you remember Christmas? Charles said oh, and slightly raised a finger in recollection. You're the captain who negotiated with me. Yes, my name is Claude, Colonel. Claude kindly reintroduced himself. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, Charles readily admitted. He was Chinese at heart and had almost no memory of French names. No, it's all right, Colonel. Claude looked at him with reverence. But I remember something you said. Charles smiled at Claude and asked, is it still valid? Of course, Colonel, of course it's valid, Claude nodded emphatically. After the last negotiation, before Charles left, Claude said, my men and I eagerly hope to one day fight under your command. He hesitated for a moment, then corrected, but that wasn't a promise, Colonel, it was a wish, and now that wish has come true. I feel very lucky. No, Captain, Charles shook his head meaningfully. You shouldn't feel lucky to be on the battlefield. Claude didn't speak, he disagreed. He insisted that fighting under Charles's command was a stroke of luck, and his men felt the same way. Tycoon, standing silently to the side, exchanged a glance with Claude. Tycoon deeply agreed, especially after experiencing Charles's art of war. He felt he wouldn't know how to fight without Charles. Now, Charles turned his gaze to the map and asked, how is the situation at the front? Very bad, Colonel, Claude replied, pointing to the map. Our left flank is the sea, and our right flank is the French 45th Division, but we can't have any hope for them. Charles asked, are they terrified by the gas? You could say that. Claude nodded, then added, they are the Algerian Division. Charles instantly understood, the French colonial army. From the Algerian Division's perspective, they certainly wouldn't fight to the death for the French at this time. The French had always discriminated against and exploited them. Sending them to be gassed at this crucial moment would be a miracle if they held out. The image above shows the French 45th Division, the French Algerian Division. During World War I, Captain Claude seemed to see through Charles's thoughts, a slight embarrassment on his face, because the French and British armies weren't much better off, and he couldn't really criticize the Algerian Division in this regard. However, Captain Claude didn't reveal this. He continued his analysis while looking at the map. Once our lines are breached, the Canadian and British troops on the right flank, totaling 50,000 men, will be surrounded by the Germans. The gap in our lines will widen, potentially triggering a chain reaction like dominoes. So, we have nowhere to retreat? Charles asked. Captain Claude nodded. Nowhere to retreat. In reality, they could retreat another 2 kilometers, but that would require tens of thousands of lives to retake. Note, historically, to fill this gap, the Allied forces launched a counter-offensive with the British Second Army, suffering 70,000 casualties. There's a problem with your plan, Captain, Charles said. Your idea of launching a counter-offensive before the Germans have established a firm foothold in our positions is good. But, Charles pointed to the defensive line, what if the wind direction is favorable? And the Germans use poison gas for defense? What do you plan to do then? Captain Claude's expression instantly changed. At that point, the French army had no choice but to charge towards the poison gas, otherwise their 50,000 Allied troops on the right flank would be surrounded. Chapter 340 The Strength of the Xia Army. The next morning, nothing had come to life. The long Ypres front was terrifying, almost nothing was alive. Birds, insects, ants, even the incredibly resilient rats and cockroaches had vanished. Corpses were everywhere, human, animal, and plant, and a strange stench permeated the air, whether from lingering poison gas or the rotting of corpses, was unknown. The scene resembled the end of the world. The headquarters of the 79th Infantry Division of the German 26th Army was a semi-enclosed bunker. Major General Jonas, the division commander, sat atop an ammunition box, sipping coffee and flipping through a French newspaper brought by a communications soldier. Even without looking, he could guess that the world was reporting extensively on Germany's chemical warfare, and without exception, all condemning it. Chemical warfare is inhumane, we should ban its use. This is a human tragedy, it has brought humanity's dark side to its extreme. Chemical warfare will destroy humanity, no one can control this demon, and the Germans are no exception, they will inevitably suffer the consequences. Major General Jonas smiled slightly. He put down his newspaper, stood up leisurely, and took a few steps with his coffee cup in hand, his gaze sweeping over the firing port towards the French defenses a kilometer away. These foolish people, Jonas thought, your army is failing, of course, you'll describe chemical gas as a demon. What's the difference between it and machine guns or artillery? Aren't they all deadly? Do they really think that a bullet splattering a person's brains, or a shell tossing a person into the air and instantly cutting them into pieces, or shrapnel tearing open their abdomen and letting them die slowly in agony, is more humane than chemical gas? At that moment, Major Ralph returned with his troops, the reconnaissance team Jonas had sent out. Ralph crawled into the bunker and stood before Jonas, reporting, "General, there is no residual poison gas ahead, the French 43rd Division is on our front, they have no will to fight and are ready to retreat at any moment." However, Jonas's gaze remained fixed on the French lines, and he asked coldly, "However, what? The 105th Infantry Regiment, General?" Major Ralph replied, "They say the 105th Infantry Regiment has reinforced a 43rd Division, but their exact location is unclear." The 105th Infantry Regiment, Jonas was taken aback, the unit designation sounded familiar. Then he abruptly turned to Ralph, "Charles's troops? You mean Charles is on our front?" "No, General," Ralph replied, "that is indeed Charles's troops, but they say Charles hasn't come, he's likely commanding from Paris." Jonas grunted and nodded slightly. That made sense, otherwise, if he ordered the release of poison gas, Charles would either become a corpse or be wounded and captured. After considering for a moment, Major General Jonas turned to his staff and said, "Send a telegram to General Stephen, requesting an attack on the enemy lines." "Yes, General," the staff officer responded, immediately relaying the order to the communications officer. Major General Jonas had been requesting an attack since yesterday, and this was the 5th time. Jonas believed this was an opportunity. The enemy's morale had been shattered by the sudden poison gas attack, making it the perfect time to attack, even at the risk of being affected by the residual gas. War inevitably involves danger and casualties, at other times. Achieving such a victory might require paying dozens or even hundreds of times the price. However, General Stephen always responded, "Relax, Jonas, we don't need to rush, if we can win the first battle, we can win the next one too. We should gain experience from it so that we can better defeat the enemy and achieve a complete victory." These words sounded very reasonable. As long as the enemy didn't find a way to counter the poison gas, the German army would always be victorious. However, Jonas remained worried about missing an opportunity. Now, the enemy had sent Charles's troops. Had Charles found a way to counter the poison gas? No, Jonas quickly dismissed the idea. If Charles had found a solution, he shouldn't be hiding in Paris but with his troops. Soon, a staff officer returned with a telegram, "General, General Stephen has agreed to a request, but he believes we should start with a conventional attack." Jonas grunted in understanding. Due to their hasty attack, the Germans didn't have enough poison gas reserves, they needed to use their resources wisely. Jonas raised his binoculars and observed for a while. He noticed the enemy opposite seemed to be constructing fortifications, with dust rising faintly from the trenches. Jonas checked his pocket watch and ordered, "All hands prepare. Attack in 10 minutes, yes, General," the staff officer responded, quickly running to the trenches to give the order. The orders were relayed, and the German soldiers immediately rose and began to prepare their gear. Some loaded their rifles, others emptied half of their overfilled canteens to light to their load, and still others stuffed extra grenades into their satchels. Then, one by one, they stood silently before the trenches, rifles in hand, waiting. Their breathing grew heavy, and their bayonets gleamed in the sunlight. The officer walked along, loudly reassuring his men, "Relax, lads. They're terrified by the gas. This time, just like before, we just need to charge in, take their line, that's it, hold on, dot." Now, a sharp whistle blared, and at the same time, artillery shells whistled overhead and slammed into the enemy positions. The German soldiers shouted as they scrambled up the ladders, then stumbled and staggered along the muddy ground of Ypres towards the enemy trenches. They hoped their officer was right, that this battle would be as easy as before, and that it would always be this way. But the reality was far from it. The enemy's counter-fire was fierce. To be precise, it wasn't just fierce, but precise. Their bullets seemed to have eyes, relentlessly killing officers, machine gunners, medics, and other vital units. This chilled the German troops as they advanced. Without officers, they lost command and leadership. Without machine gunners, they lacked fire support. Without medics, all they could think about was lying alone in shell craters, waiting for death until the very end. For the soldiers, it was practically a suicide mission to the enemy lines, a tragic and miserable death. Major General Jonas, observing the battle, also sensed this. The enemy didn't have many machine guns or dense artillery fire, but strangely, they seemed to be relentlessly pressing the Germans, creating an invisible pressure on everyone, including Major General Jonas. Was this the strength of the Charles army? Major General Jonas wondered. What was Charles trying to do? Why would he send such an elite force to the front lines to face poison gas? Chapter 341 Mobile Defense. This was intentional on Charles's part. He immediately dispatched Billy Shen's sniper company to the front lines to demonstrate the strength of the 105th Infantry Regiment. "This will force the enemy to use poison gas on us," Charles said. "What?" Tidjany and Claude both looked at Charles with puzzled expressions. Captain Claude didn't understand why Charles was doing the opposite, when other units hoped the Germans wouldn't use poison gas on them. Tidjany didn't understand why Charles wanted to force the enemy. Charles pointed to the Algerian division's position on the flank of the defensive line on the map, saying, "If the Germans use poison gas in this area, the Algerian division will collapse instantly, our defensive line will be split in two, and we will be surrounded on this side of the coastline." This was actually more terrifying than poison gas. At that point, the 43rd Infantry Division and the 105th Infantry Regiment would have no choice but to jump into the sea if they didn't surrender. Tidjany suddenly realized, "So, you want to force the enemy to use poison gas against us?" "Yes," Charles nodded. "We are an elite force, while the Algerian division is a rabble. If there's no difference between elite troops and rabble under poison gas, which would you choose?" Tidjany secretly praised him. Of course, he would choose to poison the elite troops. It's human nature, but they hadn't considered that using poison gas on the rabble might achieve a better effect. However, upon further reflection, Tidjany felt there was a flaw in this approach. "I wonder if you've considered this, Colonel," Tidjany said, frowning. "Everyone knows that the 105th Infantry Regiment is Charles's elite. Since elite troops and rabble are no different under poison gas, why did the French send this elite force to the front lines and expose their strength so immediately?" The Germans weren't fools. They would definitely think, "This might be a conspiracy by Charles, he's trying to lure us into using poison gas." Then, the Germans would likely guess what Charles would invent to counter poison gas. "You've learned to think from the enemy's perspective, General," Charles praised. Tidjany smiled smugly. "After all, fighting alongside you, Colonel, I must improve." Tidjany's eyes held gratitude and a hint of respect. He regarded Charles as his mentor. "So, I made some preparations before coming here," Charles replied. "Preparations?" Tidjany was puzzled. What preparations could dispel the German suspicions? Captain Claude remained bewildered. Wasn't the main point how to protect against poison gas? Yet they kept discussing irrelevant issues. Had I overlooked something? Meanwhile, German Major General Jonas was lost in thought. He watched his troops retreat like a tide, his mind focused on only one question: Why was Charles so confident in placing his elite troops, which he had personally built, at the front lines? To stabilize morale? Perhaps the arrival of the 105th Infantry Regiment had indeed stabilized morale. But if it collapsed like all other units in the face of poison gas, the result would not only fail to stabilize morale, but would also push the fear of poison gas to another climax. For political gain? Jonas believed that anyone else would do this, but not Charles, absolutely not. Although Jonas had never met Charles, he believed he understood him. Charles might not be the conscientious capitalist others claimed, nor the selfless figure the French believed, nor was he driven by a desire to monopolize the arms market like many French capitalists. One thing was certain, Charles respected life. From the development of the tank to Antwerp and Gallipoli, everything he did was aimed at minimizing casualties. Major General Jonas believed that Charles didn't actually care about politics. He was forced onto the path of confrontation with capitalists. Someone like him wouldn't send a unit to its death for political gain. Therefore, there was only one possibility. Charles had a new invention that could protect against poison gas, and Charles was fearless. General, the staff officer handed Jonas a telegram. General Stephen thinks we should release the poison gas. The wind direction is perfect now. Major General Jonas considered for a moment, then shook his head. No, I think there's a problem, at least not here, assuming that Charles had indeed developed something, but it hadn't been equipped to other units yet, only the 105th Infantry Regiment. Then, Jonas thought it made more and more sense. He turned his gaze to the map, believing they should attack in other directions. But at that moment, a communications soldier a few meters away, holding a microphone, looked at Major General Jonas and called out, General Stephen is on the phone. He wants to talk to you. Major General Jonas knew why. He quickly stepped forward, took the receiver, and immediately stated his thoughts. General, I think Charles might have developed a device to counter poison gas, so I think we should be cautious. No, Jonas, came Lieutenant General Stephen's anxious voice from the other end of the line. Now is the best time to annihilate the 105th Infantry Regiment. Your hesitation could cause us to miss this opportunity, but don't you find it strange that the 105th Infantry Regiment is at the front lines at this time? Nothing strange about it. They don't have any poison gas protection equipment. Charles just thinks he's found a tactic to counter poison gas. A tactic to counter poison gas? Yes, Lieutenant General Stephen replied. In today's French newspaper, Le Monde, Charles expressed his views on poison gas at the City Defense Command. He believes that poison gas is not as terrible as imagined, and the enemy will not be able to enter the position before it dissipates. Therefore, as long as we dig more trenches in the rear and engage the enemy in a drawn-out battle, we can succeed. He calls this tactic mobile defense, Jonas said, instantly understanding. Although he didn't know the specifics, hearing the term mobile defense made him understand what the tactic was. It did seem like a feasible method. Jonas smiled, but Charles seemed not to have considered the wind direction. The German soldiers would advance with the wind. As long as the wind was right, the French soldiers would always be a step behind the Germans, unless Charles could make the wind blow backwards. Thus, Jonas's doubts vanished. He believed that Charles had no better way, and the 105th Infantry Regiment was here only to verify Charles's so-called mobile defense. On the other end of the phone, Lieutenant General Stephen ordered, release the poison gas immediately to rout the French 105th Infantry Regiment. This is crucial. This wasn't just a matter of an elite unit, it was a matter of damaging the morale and confidence of the French army. Yes, General, Jonas replied. After hanging up, Major General Jonas firmly ordered his staff, observe the wind direction and prepare the poison gas. Chapter 342 Charles is here. The sun rose from the clouds, illuminating the blood and corpses on the Ypres line, casting a shocking red glow across the land. At that moment, the soldiers of the French 43rd Division were eating breakfast, mashed potatoes, just delivered from the rear by the cooks. It arrived more than an hour late and was already as cold as ice. This was the logistics unit's fear of poison gas. They dared not even step across the territory, despite the soldiers' repeated emphasis that the gas was visible. As the soldiers scooped up the clumps of mashed potatoes and ate them, they complained, "They avoid us like the plague." Yes, they dropped their food and rushed back. I just patted Jamie on the shoulder, and he screamed and ran away. He must think the gas is contagious. The soldiers laughed, a bitter laugh tinged with their own amusement. If even the cooks were this afraid, what were they, the soldiers waiting on the front lines for the enemy's poison gas? to do? Suddenly, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The sporadic gunfire ceased, leaving only the sea breeze and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks in the distance. Captain Raphael raised his hand to signal the soldiers to be quiet. The trenches fell silent, fear gripping everyone's faces. They knew what this meant. The captain hesitated for a moment, then put down his mess kit, took out the binoculars hanging from his waist, and cautiously peeked out from behind the trench ramp. The image above shows a trench ramp, used by soldiers for firing. In the later stages of World War I, as trench warfare developed, the trenches became deeper and more sophisticated due to soldiers spending long periods in them. The captain observed for a while, seeing nothing, and breathed a sigh of relief. However, just as he put away his binoculars and was about to retreat, he suddenly noticed a faint, thick fog slowly rising from the opposite side. The captain quickly grabbed his binoculars again and looked at the target. It was yellowish-green, growing larger and larger until soon the entire defensive line appeared, like a wall. "Poison gas," the captain shouted confidently, turning back. The trench erupted into chaos. Soldiers were like ants on a hot plate. Some rushed back to the trenches to grab their belongings, others propped their rifles up on the trench walls, food spilled everywhere, and many more frantically looked to their officers for orders. They were waiting for the order to retreat. The officers and soldiers had reached a consensus: if the poison gas came, they should retreat. Staying here meant certain death. It was pointless. The captain observed the situation for a moment longer. The wind was stronger today, meaning the gas was more deadly and could reach the position in 10 minutes. He no longer had time to report to his superiors or wait for orders. Thinking this, the captain made a decisive decision: retreat. Immediately, he led his troops to retreat along the trench. However, the trench was already packed with people, everywhere scrambling to get back. Fear made them shout and push, blocking the trench and preventing anyone from moving. "Climb up," the captain gestured towards the top of the trench. The soldiers understood, working together to lift their comrades onto the trenches with their shoulders, then pulling those below up. Ignoring the danger of being exposed to the enemy, they stumbled and ran like madmen. On the German side, Major General Jonas stood on high ground, observing the French defenses through binoculars. When hordes of French deserters came into view, his heart, which had been pounding, finally relaxed. "There's no gas protection," Major General Jonas muttered to himself. "Otherwise, they wouldn't need to run," and in such a panicked way, Major General Jonas felt a pang of disappointment. He seemed to have overestimated Charles. Little did Major General Jonas know, this was exactly what Charles wanted him to see. Charles kept gas masks a closely guarded secret, especially from the 43rd Division. Everyone's gas mask should be in their backpack. No one is allowed to take it out or try it on without orders, Charles ordered. "And don't tell anyone." This left the soldiers of the 43rd Division completely ignorant about gas masks, which was one of the reasons they panicked and crumbled upon seeing the poison gas. Even Captain Claude and his men, who were fighting alongside the 105th Infantry Regiment, were only informed and issued a set each in the early hours of the morning. Captain Claude stared at the strange object in his hand, his jaw dropping in astonishment. He asked doubtfully, "Is this really effective?" "Have you tried it?" Tijani replied. "Someone must have tried it, Captain." Captain Claude suddenly realized, "We wouldn't happen to be the ones who tried it, would we?" "You guessed right." Tijani smiled and nodded, then nodded at Charles, including the colonel. Captain Claude suddenly remembered something, didn't ask any more questions, and without another word, carried the gas masks back and distributed them to the soldiers. The soldiers, with the same doubts, examined the gas masks in their hands. "Are you sure it works, Captain? If it doesn't, we're just waiting to die here. Is it some kind of capitalist scam?" No wonder the soldiers were suspicious. French capitalists had deceived the people for money more than once. The military and civilians felt more disgust than trust towards them. Besides, the Germans had used poison gas just yesterday, and France could produce gas masks today. It all seemed suspicious. However, Captain Claude answered casually, "You're right, we can't trust capitalists. But it's special because it was made by Charles. Also, you might not know, but Charles is here too." The soldiers exclaimed, "Charles is here too? That's impossible. I heard he's in Paris." "That's what the newspapers say, today's papers." Captain Claude simply smiled and said nothing. Then, Charles emerged from the tunnel and stood before everyone, smiling and waving to the soldiers. "Hello, gentlemen, The soldiers were all stunned. They had seen Charles once before, on Christmas Day. Although it was night, they still clearly remembered his appearance. The colonel before them was Charles. He was on the front lines, facing the gas alongside them. What did they have to worry about? At this moment, many soldiers of the 105th Infantry Regiment had only just learned that Charles was in the trenches. He's really here. I always thought he was in Paris. I was worried about the gas masks, but now it seems there was no need for that. Yes, Charles is with us. They'll definitely be useful. So, while the 43rd Infantry Division retreated like a tide, not a single soldier of the 105th Infantry Regiment, including Captain Claude, moved. They all quietly hid in the trenches. At the same time, they also made use of the tunnels vacated by the 43rd Infantry Division, hiding in groups of 2 or 3 and sealing the tunnel entrances with prepared sandbags and damp cloths. Chapter 343 New Developments. This was to extend the lifespan of gas masks. Activated carbon gas masks purify the air by adsorbing toxic gases with carbon particles, thus achieving protection. However, this doesn't mean they can be used indefinitely or repeatedly. When a certain saturation level is reached, their adsorption of toxic gas particles weakens significantly, requiring the filter canister to be replaced. Of course, it's impossible to call a halt during combat to give French soldiers time to replace their canisters. Charles's solution was to utilize the tunnels. The air inside the tunnels before the toxic gas reached the trenches was usable, although it was mixed with various unbearable odors, sweat, urine, and even feces. The British and French armies failed in this regard. Their trenches were often a complete mess, not only chaotic and disorganized but also plagued by serious problems with living habits and personal hygiene. They often dug pits in the tunnels to relieve themselves, and over time, these so-called urination pits became ubiquitous throughout the tunnels. Especially since the troops were rotated every 2 weeks, new soldiers often didn't know where the urinals dug by their predecessors were, leading to frequent dangerous situations. In contrast, the German trenches were well organized and even had dedicated toilets, which the British and French troops often couldn't help but admire when they captured them. However, even if the French tunnels were unbearable, at least they were non-toxic, and the air inside could sustain a person for several hours under extreme conditions. After the tunnel entrance was sealed, the whole world fell silent. There were no gunshots, no screams, no cries. Charles felt as if he were cut off from the world. He even wanted to dig through the sandbags to look outside, but reason suppressed this impulse. He could imagine that outside was filled with yellowish-green toxic gas, heavier than air, which would accumulate in the trenches and linger for a long time, even with a howling sea breeze. Charles later learned that some soldiers had indeed peeked out through the damp cloth, unaware of the gravity of the situation. The poisonous gas that seeped in immediately reacted with strong acid upon contact with his eyes, causing burns. Fortunately, the others managed to plug the leak in time, preventing the gas from further eroding the tunnel and averting a tragedy. In contrast to their oppressive atmosphere, Charles's command post fared much better. His telephone line connected him to observers at the rear, who monitored the battlefield from several angles using high-powered binoculars and reported intelligence to Charles as needed. The gas has occupied the positions and continues to advance deeper. Perhaps the reserves are small. The amount of gas released this time is clearly less than yesterday. No, that's probably a wind speed issue. Today the wind speed is 9.7 meters per second, which makes the gas spread faster and appears thinner than yesterday. Judging from this, the gas may dissipate faster today than yesterday. Charles sat quietly at his desk, made of ammunition boxes, listening to the reports while staring at the map in front of him in the beam of a flashlight, pondering a remark Captain Claude had casually made. They only advanced 3.25 kilometers, and then stopped to dig trenches and build fortifications. Why 3.25 kilometers? Why dig trenches and build fortifications themselves? There was a French defensive line about 2.5 kilometers away, which the Germans could easily utilize. With a little modification, it could be turned into a reverse trench. After thinking for a moment, Charles realized it was due to the poison gas. They'll cross our line, Charles said. There won't be a trench battle. Charles's battle plan was for the Germans to rush into the trenches, and the 105th Infantry Regiment to emerge from the tunnels and kill the enemy who were trying to seize them. Now it seemed that this was unlikely to happen at all. What? Tidjany didn't understand Charles's meaning. He shone his flashlight on Charles, but quickly realized it would make Charles uncomfortable and turned the beam away. Charles's flashlight beam remained fixed on the map. He pointed to the German line and said, "Yesterday, the Germans didn't occupy the French line they abandoned. Instead, they rebuilt one. Isn't that a coincidence?" Tycoon asked. "Perhaps the Germans wanted to get closer to the French line." "It's not a coincidence," Charles replied calmly. "It's because of the poison gas." "Poison gas?" Tycoon couldn't help but lean closer, then exclaimed. "Oh, understanding dawned on him. You mean, poison gas is heavier than air, so it settles in the tunnels?" "Yes," Charles answered. "The tunnels are 2.5 meters deep. Once the poison gas sinks into the tunnels, it's difficult for the wind to blow it away. It might take a whole day to slowly dissipate, and the Germans can't wait that long." "Yes," Tycoon nodded vigorously. "If they waited a whole day, our army would have already fought back. But if we choose a new location and new tunnels, this problem won't exist." This was what Charles meant. It wasn't a coincidence. To avoid being accidentally injured by the poison gas, the German army had to cross the trenches and continue advancing. Then Tycoon exclaimed, "God, if that's the case, when we get out, we'll be behind the enemy, and we can attack them from behind." "Is that what you're thinking?" Charles countered. "What's the problem?" Tycoon's voice held a hint of doubt. "We can win easily, Colonel." Charles shook his head, his flashlight beam slowly moving forward, pointing towards the German lines and even reaching their rear. Tycoon instantly understood. "You mean, we attack forward instead of attacking the German rear?" "The rear is just the German frontline troops, General," Charles explained. "It might only be a regiment, at most a brigade. Even if we surround or even rout them, what then? We might even lose our own lines and territory." Tycoon nodded in agreement. The French lines were undefended because they were stored in poison gas. Attacking from the rear, even if victorious, would inevitably mean losing the lines, because they still contained poison gas. At this moment, Charles added, "What do you think will happen if we continue our advance?" Prompted by Charles's words, Tycoon's gaze shifted towards the depths of the German lines, and then he excitedly exclaimed, "We might stumble upon the enemy command post, capture a lot of supplies, and more importantly, we can seize the German trenches." "No, our trenches," Charles interrupted Tycoon, pointing about 2 kilometers ahead, "the French trenches the Germans had crossed the previous day." "That's right, Colonel," Tycoon immediately realized. "The German lines were built in a day, they're simpler and face us. The French trenches are what we need. They're more comprehensive and face the right direction." Without hesitation, Tycoon immediately informed the battalion commanders of the new situation and the new operational plan by telephone. Chapter 344 Desperate Counterattack. About half an hour later, before the poison gas had completely dissipated, the German army launched an impatient attack. This was Major General Jonas's order. He feared the 105th Infantry Regiment would stabilize its position in the rear, organize another defensive line, and then, as Charles had predicted, implement mobile defense to recapture the line. With a sharp whistle, German soldiers crawled out of their trenches one by one. Wearing pilot goggles and covering their mouths and noses with cotton cloths soaked in sodium carbonate solution, they carefully waded through the muddy battlefield, rifles in hand. This was a solution proposed by the German chemist Fritz Haber, who had developed poison gas and, of course, would try to take measures to prevent friendly fire. The image above shows Fritz Haber, the German chemist who developed poison gas, synthesized ammonia, and won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. However, this cotton cloth had the same problem as activated carbon gas masks. Its protective effect only lasted for a limited time. Before long, the German army advanced to the French defensive line. Smoke billowed inside the trench, with a faint yellowish-green tinge visible, clearly indicating lingering poison gas. Colonel Fabian walked to the edge of the trench, pistol in hand, and peeked inside briefly before quickly pulling back. In that single glance, he confirmed it was safe ahead. The trench was a mess, littered with spilled food, discarded luggage, and overflowing ammunition boxes, except for a few gruesome corpses. They hadn't even had time to move the machine gun. Several German soldiers tried to jump down and retrieve the machine gun, a valuable asset for the frontline troops, but Colonel Fabian stopped them. "Keep moving," Colonel Fabian commanded loudly, his voice muffled by the cotton cloth covering his face. "See those corpses? If you don't want to end up like them, ignore these machine guns." The German soldiers responded sparsely, carrying pre-prepared planks across the trench, one by one stepping over them. Occasionally, a soldier would accidentally fall into the trench. After scrambling out, They would hurriedly hold their breath and retrieve spare sterile cotton pads to change into. Unbeknownst to the German soldiers, an entire regiment of French soldiers was lurking in the trenches beneath their feet, the very regiment they were pursuing, the 105th French Infantry Regiment. Major General Jonas watched the soldiers disappear into the smoke through his binoculars, then waved his hand, and another regiment of soldiers emerged from the trenches and followed. These were his two most elite infantry regiments. Dealing with the 105th Infantry Regiment is different, Major General Jonas muttered, putting away his binoculars. Charles' troops deserve our caution. He then turned to his staff officer, order the troops to advance at least 2 kilometers. Yes, General, the staff officer replied, ordering the signalman to relay the order through flags to the advancing troops. Watching the troops disappear from sight, Major General Jonas felt a sense of Gan 3 Chi 3, a complex feeling of mixed emotions, often including nostalgia or regret. With poison gas, the fighting seemed simpler. We should produce more poison gas so we can gradually achieve victory and end this war, saving many lives. From this perspective, poison gas shouldn't be seen as a demon, it's simply a weapon that can save lives. Just then, Major General Jonas caught a glimpse of something moving in the French trench. At first, he didn't pay much attention, assuming it was a stray German soldier. But he quickly realized something was wrong. The commotion in the French trench grew louder, more and more heads emerged, and yellowish-green poison gas, due to frequent airflow fluctuations, slowly drifted into the air from the trench. Major General Jonas's expression changed. It was the enemy. A large number of enemies, hiding there undetected, and clearly, they could survive in the poison gas. God, I was right, Major General Jonas thought, a jolt running through him. Charles had invented gas-proof equipment. Then Major General Jonas confirmed this. Through the aperture of his binoculars, he saw a special device on the French soldier's face, a completely sealed device with a pig-like snout protruding from its mouth and nose. Enemy situation. Major General Jonas didn't hesitate, turning and shouting to both sides, prepare for battle. The enemy is coming. The soldiers were instantly stunned. How could there be enemy activity at this hour? Here. They followed Major General Jonas's gaze and were horrified to see masked French soldiers emerging from the trenches, which were filled with poison gas and seemed to contain only the dead. Their lenses and respirators looked rather frightening. The soldiers panicked. Only a reserve infantry battalion and a guard company remained in the trenches, totaling just over 500 men, while the enemy in front of them was at least an infantry regiment. Major General Jonas's face turned ashen. He knew what he was facing and hastily issued another order the 297th Regiment to return to reinforce. That was the 2nd Regiment he had sent out. If he hadn't gone far, their return would allow them to launch a pincer attack on the enemy. But things on the battlefield are not as simple as they seem. Before Major General Jonas could even give the order, several shots rang out, and the signalman waving the signal flag was shot down. Sniper. Major General Jonas's expression shifted rapidly. The French unit before him was the 105th Infantry Regiment he was looking for. It was ironic, Major General Jonas had been trying to catch up with and annihilate it, but now it was right in front of him, and now it was trying to kill him. Before the German soldiers could react, the French launched their charge. Squads of soldiers in red trousers swept in like a storm. There were no shouts of battle, because they wore masks. Even so, the Germans could clearly feel the enemy's killing intent. Their firm steps, the gleaming needle-shaped bayonets, and the dark muzzles of their guns all seemed to indicate that they wanted revenge for their comrades who had died from the poison gas. Machine gun, Major General Jonas shouted, organize fire to stop them, but it was useless. The 105th Infantry Regiment had already set up sniper positions in their lines, and the German machine guns were suppressed and rendered immobile by the constant barrage of gunfire. Soon, mortar shells rained down on the German trenches, and screams erupted from the German positions as machine gunners and their machines were blown to bits. Major General Jonas glanced at the gas canisters behind him. It might be his last resort, to take the enemy with him. But he quickly realized it wouldn't work. The enemy was wearing gas masks. Opening the canisters would only result in his own death. General, retreat, his staff officer shouted beside him. Major General Jonas hesitated. Retreat meant a complete rout. 2 infantry regiments left behind and the enemy lines might never return. But if he didn't retreat, though it was only a moment's hesitation, it was already too late. The French had already breached a 50-meter line, and volleys of smoking grenades rained down into the German trenches. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 345 Another Fan. After a series of grenade explosions, French soldiers quickly rose and rushed into the German trenches. The German trenches were makeshift, constructed in a few hours, only a little over a meter deep. The French soldiers, undeterred, leaped into the trenches still shrouded in smoke, brandishing their bayonets and stabbing wildly, indiscriminately piercing any living creature. The French needle-shaped bayonet was advantageous because it was less prone to jamming, but its disadvantages were equally obvious. It only inflicted a small hole, and unless it hid a vital area, the enemy often remained combat-ready. French soldiers, accustomed to using this type of bayonet, had developed a habit of stabbing the same target multiple times in different areas. Thus, the battlefield resounded with the sounds of bayonets piercing flesh, a series of sharp, grating sounds, accompanied by screams of pain from German soldiers, some even begging for mercy. But the French soldiers did not hesitate. They continued to thrust their bayonets at their targets, again and again. Then, covered in blood, they pressed their red-stained rifles and continued their charge towards the next line of defense, pursuing the fleeing German troops. The 105th Infantry Regiment's order of attack consisted of 2 infantry battalions at the front, a sniper company in the middle, and the last infantry battalion as reserves. Charles and Tigny advanced with the reserves. However, Billy Shen stayed by Charles's side the entire time. Upon entering the German trenches, he impatiently removed his gas mask and threw it on the ground. "I don't like this," Billy Shen said. The gas mask's visor was made of ordinary glass, allowing observation of the battlefield or the path, but inevitably causing refraction and affecting accuracy when aiming. Billy Shen had already missed 2 targets, one of which was aimed at Charles. Fortunately, Charles hit him in time, preventing a major disaster. What impact would it have on the army if Charles had fallen on the battlefield? Billy Shen dared not imagine the scenario. Charles also removed his gas mask. The Germans here weren't wearing gas protection, so it was definitely safe. "Colonel," Tigny called out. Charles followed the sound, crouching low as he ran forward to a section of the collapsed trench. He saw Tigny squatting in front of a corpse. It wasn't quite a corpse yet, because he was still alive, but he was about to become one. For his chest was covered in blood, his face was as white as paper, and he was struggling to breathe, clutching his chest. Heaven knows how many times he had been stabbed by the brutal French soldiers. It was too much. "He's a major general." Tigny flipped up his shoulder insignia, revealing his rank to Charles. "He's also received medals." He gestured with his chin towards the iron cross on the major general's chest. "I'm sorry." Charles knelt down beside him, his tone sincere. They couldn't distinguish officers from soldiers in the smoke. If they had known you were a major general, they would have shown mercy. Charles was telling the truth. This wasn't because of the Geneva Conventions or chivalry. Those things no longer existed after the Germans used poison gas. It was because a German major general could extract useful intelligence from him. Note, the Geneva Convention was first signed in 1864, and France was one of the first 12 signatories. Charles and Tigny planned to abandon him, as the battle ahead was more important. But then the German major general's eyes suddenly lit up. You're Charles? You're Charles, you recognize me?" Charles looked at him questioningly. No, the German major general answered with difficulty, reaching out his hand, which had been used to cover his wound and was still dripping blood. I'm honored." Charles reached out to respond but grasped nothing. His head tilted and his hand fell to the ground, suddenly losing strength like a kite with a broken string. However, he had a smile on his face, and although he wasn't angry, a trace of relief could still be seen. "Another fan of yours," Tigny joked. "I guess he wants your autograph on his corpse." As he spoke, Tigny tore off his shoulder insignia and iron cross, evidence that the 105th Infantry Regiment had killed a German major general. Before leaving, Tigny noticed dozens of unused gas canisters stored in a tunnel. He asked, "What do we do with these?" Charles, without much thought, replied, "Leave a company behind. If the Germans return, open them." "Good idea," Tigny nodded. "This will ensure the safety of our rear." With almost no effective resistance, the unprepared German army was routed. The 105th Infantry Regiment then ran headlong into a reinforcement artillery regiment. These were German 105mm howitzers, advancing victoriously behind the main force, intending to provide artillery support to the front lines. They never expected a French army to suddenly appear. The German artillerymen, setting up their guns, were routed by the 105th Infantry Regiment before they could even grab their rifles. This added 31 artillery pieces and over 2,000 rounds of ammunition to Charles's record. Charles and Tigny thought that was enough. The victory was already impressive. In this battle, the 105th Infantry Regiment not only recaptured lost territory during the enemy's gas attack, but also routed an enemy infantry battalion and destroyed a divisional command post. The fighting resulted in the deaths of a major general and several colonels whose numbers were not yet tallied, and the capture of an artillery regiment's equipment, while the 105th Infantry Regiment suffered negligible casualties. Furthermore, 2 other enemy infantry regiments were surrounded, cut off from supplies and their rear, facing only annihilation or surrender. Such a victory would be a source of pride for anyone. However, Charles did not realize that this was only the beginning. When Tigny led his troops 2 kilometers into the trenches abandoned by the French the previous day, he was astonished to find them filled with Germans. The term Germans is used instead of German troops because they were not regular German soldiers. This trench, a well-preserved trench long-standing for the French army, was well-equipped and spacious. The Germans had converted it into a supply depot. Besides a field hospital, it contained ample food and ammunition, and more importantly, a corps headquarters, the 26th Army headquarters. When French soldiers jumped into the trench and pointed their rifles at the medics and logistics personnel, the Germans were completely bewildered and became prisoners of war. After discovering the anomaly, the German command attempted to break out with their guard company in the chaos. However, they quickly realized that the moment they stepped out of the trench, their backs would be exposed to enemy fire. Outside the trench lay open ground with excellent visibility, but it was a muddy, impassable area. French soldiers easily suppressed them with machine gun fire, rendering them immobile. Ultimately, they could only surrender one by one, raising their rifles. Among them were a lieutenant general, a major general, and 8 colonels. Chapter 346 The Glory of Victory. The French people experienced a shift from despair to jubilation. Charles's battle plan was kept strictly secret, even from the city's garrison command, including Gallieni. Therefore, when the 43rd Division collapsed under the poison gas, everyone assumed Charles had failed. Initially, some speculated it was a mobile defense. Charles's plan was exactly like that. He would retreat when the enemy released the gas and launch a counterattack when it dissipated, so this isn't a failure. But soon, others countered, that wasn't mobile defense, it was a wind speed issue. Today, the high winds caused the gas to spread rapidly to the pre-designated defensive positions, a full 3 kilometers away. Everyone was retreating, including the 105th Infantry Regiment. Then people fell silent. They knew one thing, even Charles and his elite troops couldn't survive under poison gas, therefore this battle must have been a defeat. Some offered excuses for Charles. Charles did his best. It was an accident. Yes, it was poison gas. No one can handle it, but at least Charles tried. His actions were still courageous. However, people couldn't hide the disappointment and fear on their faces. They couldn't help but think, if even Charles couldn't handle the poison gas, it seemed that France only had surrender as an option. In the town of Darvest, Camille was arguing with Djoka. "Are you sure Charles is at the city defense headquarters and not at the front lines?" Camille asked. She had heard that Charles's 105th Infantry Regiment had been routed in the fight against the poison gas and was missing. "Of course," Djoka answered confidently, "he's at the city defense headquarters. He was there giving interviews to reporters this morning." As he spoke, Djoka handed Camille a copy of the Heroic Deeds newspaper, which contained a photo of Charles at the city defense headquarters, dated today. Camille took the newspaper, glanced at it, and secretly breathed a sigh of relief. But then she flipped through the newspaper again, looking up warily at Djoka. "How do I know if you smuggled this newspaper?" Like last time, Djoka was taken aback, then explained helplessly, "It's true, Camille. The neighbors all know. They say it's fortunate Charles wasn't on the battlefield. The 105th Infantry Regiment might have been completely wiped out. The 105th Infantry Regiment hadn't retreated with the 43rd Division. The fleeing French soldiers thought they had been left behind and poisoned. Some speculated that the 105th Infantry Regiment did so to cover the main force's retreat. It was a heroic act, They protected our safety, they expressed their gratitude, their eyes still filled with fear of the poison gas, some even trembling. Camille secretly breathed a sigh of relief. She knew this wasn't something to be happy about. The annihilation of the 105th Infantry Regiment was also a tragedy, but at least Charles was safe, which was better than anything else. However, the news quickly took a turn for the worse. Someone outside shouted, "The 105th Infantry Regiment has won. They've routed the Germans and recaptured lost territory. Charles is on the battlefield." He personally led the 105th Infantry Regiment in a counter-offensive against the enemy, braving poison gas. That wasn't mobile defense. They weren't afraid of the poison gas, they launched a counter-offensive risking their lives. Camille instantly turned pale with fright, staring at Joka with eyes full of rage. Joka, his mouth agape, looked back at Camille with an innocent expression. This time, everything he said was true. France was in an uproar. Before the true intelligence could be released, everyone was speculating about how Charles and the 105th Infantry Regiment had achieved their victory. I think it was Charles's magic. His personal presence on the front lines boosted the troops' morale, leading to this victory, but even with high morale, they couldn't withstand poison gas. Perhaps they launched their attack the moment Germany released the gas. There wasn't much gas yet, and it would take some time for it to take effect. Opinions varied, everyone had different ideas. What they all shared was their profound admiration for Charles's heroic act of personally leading the charge and turning the tide, and their concern for Charles and his troops. He saved France and saved us once again. God, that's poison gas. It's unimaginable that they charged the enemy through poison gas. Won't they suffer any lasting effects? I heard many people went blind because of it. People spontaneously gathered outside the city's defense headquarters. They knew this was the command post most closely connected to Charles, and they hoped Gallieni could give them a definite answer that Charles was safe. Gallieni didn't intend to say much, a matter of military secrecy, as the war wasn't over yet. But people continued to gather downstairs, their numbers increasing, and they lingered even past lunchtime. Just then, Foch's phone rang. "Congratulations, General," Foch said. "The battle is over, they've won," but Gallieni wasn't concerned. "Charles is safe, isn't he?" Gallieni asked cautiously. Although he knew about the gas masks, he was still worried about Charles's safety, given that they had penetrated deep into enemy territory. "Yes," Foch replied. "Charles is confirmed safe. He led the attack through the gas. It was heroic, a model for us all." Foch deliberately emphasized the word attack. This victory perfectly aligned with his offensive theory, and praising Charles was praising himself. Foch then added, after their failed attempts to break out, the two German infantry regiments had no choice but to surrender to army. They suffered approximately 2,000 casualties, mostly from their own poison gas. These two infantry regiments were German troops advancing behind the gas field. Charles's forces suddenly appeared in their rear and occupied the defensive line, leaving them with only the ammunition they carried. They were forced to consider using ammunition abandoned by the French army in the trenches. However, those trenches were filled with poison gas, and their makeshift protective clothing quickly became ineffective, resulting in many people succumbing to their own poison gas. "The information blockade can be lifted now," Foch said with deep respect. "I believe this honor should be bestowed upon you, General, so that you may tell the French people this good news." Gallieni then stepped onto the balcony and proudly shouted to the anxious crowd below, "It's true. Charles is on the battlefield. He personally led the 105th Infantry Regiment in a counterattack amidst the poison gas and achieved victory. He's alright. Charles is safe, because Charles invented a gas mask that can effectively resist the effects of poison gas. With it, we no longer need to worry about the enemy's poison gas." The crowd was stunned, then suddenly erupted in cheers. Some smiled with relief, some hugged each other in celebration, and some were moved to tears. Chapter 347 Foch's phone call. Charles and his 105th Infantry Regiment spent 2 days in the French trenches. This was to avoid losing the hard-won positions in case of a sudden German counterattack. Charles believed that troop rotation should be cautious before the position was firmly established, and the 105th Infantry Regiment could only withdraw after reinforcements from the rear had gradually arrived and adapted to the terrain. Life in the trenches was worse than expected. It was clear that the French had tried to construct trenches along higher elevations, but at 2.5 meters deep, they still inevitably leaked. In many places, the water was thigh deep. Tunnels couldn't be built in these locations, as they could collapse at any moment, or the men inside might drown. There were almost no dry spots in the trenches. Even in Charles's command post, the water was ankle-deep, making his boots squeak and feel sticky. Although it wasn't the rainy season, the water from the melting snow and ice of winter couldn't be drained, hence the current situation. In a few months, the rainy season would return, exacerbating the flooding and landslides, which explained Ypres' perpetually muddy state. It was unimaginable that the Germans, after occupying such a place, would immediately treat it as paradise and turn it into a supply depot. Soon, Charles understood why. Perhaps out of spite, the Germans launched a bombardment of the defensive line for over an hour without a moment's pause. This time, Charles felt much better. The 2.5-meter deep trenches contained tunnels, making them feel safe. Unless a shell hit the top of the tunnel and collapsed it, there was virtually no danger, and Charles suddenly realized that the flooding in the trenches wasn't so unbearable. The Germans attempted several assaults after the artillery barrage, but all quickly failed. The Germans left behind a large number of Maxim machine guns and ammunition in the trenches. The 105th Infantry Regiment utilized these machine guns, setting them up every 30 to 50 meters along the defensive line. Except for the sniper company and mortar crew, the ordinary soldiers kept their rifles aside, rushing to machine gun positions as soon as the enemy artillery fire ceased. Then, volleys of bullets rained down on the advancing German troops. Only then did Charles truly understand why World War I had developed into trench warfare, especially in Ypres. More than 2 hours later, the telephone line finally made contact with the rear, at the cost of 3 communications soldiers' lives. To Charles's surprise, the first call came in from Foch. Tidjany answered, looking at Charles with astonishment, then leaned in and whispered, "It's for you, Colonel." General Foch, commander of Army Group North. Charles hesitated. Perhaps because Charles's tactical thinking was opposed to Foch's, Charles had always tried to avoid contact with Foch to prevent disputes or even conflict. Foch seemed to share this tacit understanding. They had actually had several opportunities to meet, but each time they missed for one reason or another. Now, Foch was actually calling Charles? Was it because they couldn't avoid facing the issue? With these questions in mind, Charles answered the phone and identified himself. Foch didn't beat around the bush. "I know we have differences, Colonel, but our goals are the same, to defeat the enemy and reclaim French territory. Our differences are only in methodology, which isn't a big problem, don't you think?" Charles instantly felt relieved. He liked this way of resolving things, putting things out in the open. "Of course, General," Charles replied, "I wholeheartedly agree." Foch stated his thoughts without hesitation. "Sometimes I also doubt the correctness of the offensive theory, but we cannot deny that most victories are achieved through offense, including your battles. Admittedly, what you say seems more reasonable. Some battles require defense, and some require offense, but doesn't your statement cover all examples? It's as good as saying nothing. What we need is a definite tactic that can guide the entire army to victory, not empty and meaningless statements." In Foch's eyes, Charles's tactical theory was meaningless. Even Peytain's defensive theory had a specific focus, while Charles's tactical theory was a jack-of-all-trades that could be applied to everything. Then Foch added, "In fact, if it weren't for your repeated miraculous victories, I wouldn't even be discussing this with you. No offense intended, I just find it pointless." Charles calmly replied, "I understand, General. But what if it is true?" Foch countered. "What is true?" Charles explained. "The facts of the battlefield cannot be determined by simple, definite, black and white tactics." Foch laughed. "Is that so?" "No, I don't think so. There must be patterns." "May I ask a question, General?" Charles asked. Of course, Foch was very patient. He didn't act arrogantly because of the difference in rank. Perhaps this was because Charles's performance on the battlefield was so dazzling that he couldn't help but take him seriously. Just then, several cannon shots rang out overhead. After the gunfire subsided, Charles calmly said, "Imagine you are a teacher with 40 or 50 students, or even more. Could you teach them all well using a simple, definite, and unique method? If so, could this method be replicated globally, written down in notebooks, and copied by all teachers?" Foch was stunned. He had been a professor at St. Cyril Military Academy for several years, teaching military history and strategy, and later served as its dean. He knew very well that education was uncertain and unreplicable. Because its subjects were students, people, each with different personalities and ideas, they would react differently to the same statement. That was the difficulty of education. teachers had to tailor their teaching methods to the individual personalities of their students. Foch seemed to understand Charles's idea. You mean military theory is similar to education, it also needs to adapt to different situations, of course, Charles replied, because those fighting on the battlefield are also people, not simply war. There was silence on the other end of the line, a long pause, as if deep in thought. Charles continued, let's assume that all French troops have implemented your offensive theory, and the German commander opposite us knows this, so he knows what we're going to do next. In this situation, do you still think we can win? Foch suddenly felt that perhaps Charles was the only one correct. Because Peytain's defensive theory had the same problem, once it was fully implemented and established, the enemy would know what the French army was going to do next. Chapter 348 France owes you. At Ypres train station, a train from France slowly pulled into the station, releasing a long whistle and billowing steam with a gassy smell, instantly creating a misty, ethereal atmosphere. Ypres, a Belgian coastal city, originally had no rail connection to France. Belgium, a small country, was wary of both sides, and should have been. This was the fate of small nations, they could only strive for a balance between the major powers, with no other choice. After the outbreak of war, Belgium quickly sided with the Allied powers, and the railway from Paris to Ypres was successfully connected within 2 weeks. A group of French recruits disembarked from the train. Their uniforms were spotless, their backpacks, belts, and ammunition all in their proper places. However, their faces were filled with confusion, their eyes with fear, and they hesitantly stepped off the train, timidly surveying the unfamiliar city before them. I've heard Ypres is the toughest and most dangerous section of the defensive line. Yes, the living conditions and battlefield environment here are hell on earth. The Germans are making it a key target, and they've even started using poison gas recently. God, how did we get assigned here? Because so many people die here. Vincent, soon will be among them. These words sent chills down the spines of the soldiers, and their fear unconsciously intensified. Suddenly, a cheer erupted from ahead. Nearby pedestrians, porters, station staff, and others all stopped what they were doing and waved and shouted towards the other end of the street. The recruits curiously followed the crowd's gaze and saw a troop covered in mud and disheveled in uniform appear at the other end of the street. This was no good unit, that was the recruits' first impression. They even thought it was a retreating unit. Many of the soldiers had changed out of their red trousers, and their red caps were covered in mud, something explicitly forbidden during training. The recruits cast disdainful glances at the unit, seeing it as cowardly and weak, an act of abandoning French dignity for survival. Suddenly, the cheers grew louder, a cacophony of voices in various languages, French, English, Dutch, and even German. Well done, Charles, you're the best, you're our hero, Charles. Note, Belgium is a multilingual country. French is the dominant language in the region bordering France, while German is the dominant language closer to the German border. The recruits exchanged bewildered glances, each seeing a look of awe in the other's eyes. That's Charles's unit, the 105th Infantry Regiment. She's not what we imagined. We thought, perhaps this is what war should be like, the only way to achieve victory, not what the instructors said. The recruits looked at their red trousers and caps, then back at the 105th Infantry Regiment, weighing in their minds whether their lives or the so-called dignity of France mattered more. The 105th Infantry Regiment marched forward, heads held high, waving proudly to the cheering crowds on either side. They deserved it and accepted it with gusto. The new recruits, perhaps intimidated by the 105th Regiment's imposing presence, instinctively parted to make way for the veterans, their eyes filled with respect and envy. Charles mingled in the ranks, deliberately covering his colonel's shoulder insignia with mud. However, he underestimated the people's ability to recognize him. He's there, Charles, it really is him. God, the rumors are true, he really went to the battlefield. He was so brave facing the enemy's poison gas. I heard he captured the enemy commander in just one attack, not just the commander, but the entire command post, the German 26th Army Command. This was an unprecedented achievement. When everyone was helpless against poison gas and thought France would soon surrender, Charles's single move completely reversed the situation and crippled the German army. This drove everyone wild, especially the Belgians who had been saved by Charles before and felt indebted to him. Many wanted to offer Charles food, but he politely declined. The 105th Infantry Regiment had plenty of food, having captured a German supply depot on the front lines. Just then, several vehicles pulled up ahead, and a sharply dressed French general with a mustache strode out, surrounded by guards. He stood before the vehicles, waiting for the approaching 105th Infantry Regiment, his eyes filled with satisfaction. Someone recognized the general and exclaimed, "It's Lieutenant General Foch. He's come personally to welcome Charles and his troops. General Foch has never done anything like this before." Charles was somewhat bewildered. This seemed somewhat inappropriate. Yesterday, on the phone, Foch had tactfully told Charles, "What you said makes sense, but even so, I will still stick to my theory. I hope this won't affect our cooperation." Charles replied decisively, "Of course, General." He understood Lieutenant General Foch. Although his theory was wrong, his approach was correct. The study of military theory and the establishment of a system require time and a process. From Foch's perspective, Charles's theory wasn't necessarily correct. Even if Charles's theory were correct and Foch fully agreed, it wouldn't be possible to immediately overturn the offensive theory and replace it with Charles's theory. The offensive theory was the core of the French army. It was like a thread connecting the French army into a whole. Overturning it would be tantamount to cutting that thread. The French army would instantly scatter like beads from a broken string, and frontline commanders would not know how to command or fight. This would be extremely dangerous in wartime. Therefore, it should be advanced steadily and systematically. But now, Foch was personally greeting Charles and the 15th Infantry Regiment at the station. Was this a way of telling everyone that he approved of Charles? Filled with doubt, Charles and Tidjany quickly stepped forward and saluted Foch. Foch smiled and shook hands with both of them, saying with emotion as he shook hands with Charles, "We've finally met, Colonel." "Yes, General," Charles replied, standing at attention. "Don't worry," Foch said, looking Charles over. "I've only come to welcome the victorious French warriors. Thank you for repelling the enemy and helping us stabilize our lines." "It's what I should do, General," Charles replied mechanically. "No," Foch gently shook his head. "Others might say it's what I should do, but you're different, Colonel. You are Charles. You don't owe France anything, France owes you." Chapter 349 Lack of Romantic Understanding. The 105th Infantry Regiment received the highest honors upon their return to Paris, being granted permission to pass through the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées in the heart of the city. This archway, commissioned by Napoleon, Emperor of the First French Empire, was typically only used for celebratory events marking a decisive or at least partial victory. This underscores the significance of this victory in the eyes of the French people. Charles was not present. He disliked such occasions, especially ones that could cost him his life. The time and location for passing through the Arc de Triomphe were predetermined, posing a danger to Charles. Instead of going elsewhere, Charles reported to Galigny at the city's garrison headquarters before returning to the police training base. This was influenced by Tidjany. As commander of the 105th Infantry Regiment, Charles should prioritize his troops, not simply bring them back and discard them as if they were used and then abandoned. Only by treating the troops as one's own home will the soldiers truly accept and subscribe to one's commands. Galigny wholeheartedly agreed with this reasoning. What Charles didn't mention was that the conditions at the police training base were far superior to those at the City Defense Command. Tidjany had designed a special lounge for Charles on the third floor of the office building. It was a suite, 2 bedrooms, a living room, and over 80 square meters, with a separate bathroom, including a large bathtub. Tidjany thought this was reasonable. Charles needs a separate office, and another for resting, which will improve his work efficiency. Sometimes he also holds meetings, so a living room is essential. If Charles hadn't objected, Tidjany would have even knocked down the adjacent wall to provide Charles with a dining room, study, gym. Appropriate conditions are understandable, but excessive luxury is incongruous in a military camp. What would the soldiers, crammed into a dormitory room, think? The office building wasn't far from the street, and faint cheers could be heard, the French people celebrating the 105th Infantry Regiment's march through the Arc de Triomphe. Charles lay comfortably in the bathtub, taking a bubble bath. If there was any invention that truly impressed Charles, the bathtub was one of them. Lying quietly in the water, feeling the gentle lightness brought by the temperature and buoyancy, every pore exuded comfort and enjoyment, and all fatigue vanished instantly. Just as Charles was half asleep, his eyes slightly closed, a soft sound came from the bathroom door, and a gentle female voice called softly from outside, "Hey, little hero, do you need my help?" Charles thought it was a hallucination. He was sure he had locked the door. There were 2 sentries standing guard, and Adrian was right there. How could anyone have come in? However, with a click, the bathroom door opened. Charles was jolted awake, turning his head to see, through the faint steam, a woman dressed in vibrant colors, revealing large expanses of fair skin, and possessing a voluptuous and well-proportioned figure, standing in the doorway. She wore a charming smile, her voice alluring and seductive. "I'm in, my little hero." At that moment, Charles was captivated. This time, this place, this scene, perhaps this was exactly what he needed. He swallowed hard, his gaze lingering greedily on the woman. However, when Charles saw her face clearly under the light, he was instantly jolted awake. It was Harley, the German spy. "Guards!" Charles shouted. "Guards!" Almost simultaneously, Charles grabbed his revolver, a habit he'd developed on the battlefield. His pistol was always within easy reach, no matter the time or place. Bang! Without thinking, Charles pulled the trigger, but lying in the smooth bathtub, he missed, the bullet hitting the door frame beside Harley. Harley screamed, clutching her head and cowering on the floor, barely daring to breathe. "Don't shoot," Harley cried. Charles struggled to aim again, but was stopped by the arriving guards. "No, Colonel," the guard said, "this is General Tigny's order." "What?" Charles was stunned. Tigny had sent a German spy to assassinate him? "Yes," the guard explained, "Tigny thinks you need to relax. He's used his own money to hire Miss Harley to serve you." Charles stammered, then realized that no one knew Harley was a spy, a stripper, and the kind of stripper everyone was proud to hire. "So Tigny." "I'm sorry, Miss Harley." Charles quickly put away his gun, his tone slightly embarrassed. "I overreacted." "No, you don't need to apologize," Harley said sternly, getting up. "I knew it was unwise to take this job. Sorry, Colonel, I've disturbed you." With that, she stormed off. Tigny rushed over. His command post was on the second floor. Hearing the gunshots, he immediately realized something was wrong and ran upstairs. On the way, Tigny roughly guessed what had happened. He bumped into Harley, who had an unfriendly expression, quickly glanced at her, and secretly breathed a sigh of relief. She wasn't injured. If Harley had been killed or injured, he wouldn't know how to settle the score. Harley wasn't wrong, because she was hired by Tigny. The guard wasn't wrong, because Tigny had given prior notice. Charles wasn't wrong either. He had just returned from the battlefield and was still on guard, so a sudden appearance of someone in the room was a normal reaction. The only one at fault was Tigny. "I'm so sorry, Miss Harley." Tigny rushed after Harley, apologizing profusely. "I didn't know this would happen." "Is that so?" Harley glared angrily at Tigny. "Your ignorance almost cost me my life, General." "I'm sorry, please forgive me," Tigny said helplessly. "Next time, I'll inform him beforehand." "No, General," Harley interrupted Tigny, "there won't be a next time." With that, she turned and left without looking back. As a sought-after stripper in Paris, she had almost been shot dead by one of her clients. What puzzled Harley even more was that she clearly saw the fire in Charles's eyes. However, when he saw her face clearly, he was suddenly terrified and grabbed his pistol. Was she not attractive enough? Or was she terrifying? A humiliating disgrace. If this got out, it would be a major stain on her conquest history. Tigny didn't chase after Harley anymore. He thought it was unimportant. He turned and ran towards Charles's lounge. By then, Charles had already hurriedly put on his robe, with blisters still on his neck. "You shouldn't have done that," Charles said angrily, glaring at Tigny. Tigny shook his head helplessly, his eyes filled with pity as he looked at Charles. "You clueless wretch, you shouldn't have used that gun." Chapter 350 She is a spy. This time, Charles kept his promise and went to the officers' club that very evening to see his girlfriend. After all, it was espionage work. Forgetting this time repeatedly would make him seem unprofessional. Lucia seemed very happy. The coffee she handed Charles had a delicate tart drawn on the surface with cream. Charles secretly praised her. Lucia was perfect for a spy, playing the role of girlfriend flawlessly. "What's the good news?" Charles asked. "Of course," Lucia replied with a smile, "nothing to complain about." Charles raised an eyebrow, assuming Lucia was referring to Ypres' victory. Lucia was Belgian, the Madame in White was the Belgian intelligence agency, and Ypres was a Belgian city. Her victory meant Belgium hadn't perished, which was indeed something to celebrate. "You deserve credit," Charles affirmed the Madame in White's work. "Thanks to your intelligence, otherwise I wouldn't have known the Germans planned to use poison gas." With that, Charles handed her a check for 10,000 francs. Lucia's face instantly changed. "Are you being sarcastic, Colonel?" Lucia glanced at the check, not even looking at the amount. Is this a reward for us? We don't need rewards. You helped us, you saved Belgium, you saved many Belgian lives, once again. No, Charles replied, this is for your girlfriend's living expenses, have you forgotten? Lucia paused, remembering Charles saying before that he would provide funding for the Madame in White through her as his girlfriend. You should act like a girlfriend, Lucia, Charles reminded her. Lucia smiled bitterly. This was Charles's gift, his first gift? But Lucia didn't say anything. She leaned forward, her lips lightly touching Charles's cheek, and with a smile, she put away the check, saying, thank you, darling. Perhaps to divert attention from the awkwardness of receiving the money, Lucia picked up her coffee spoon and stirred it in her cup, asking softly, so, what they said is true, you shot Harley? Yes, Charles's voice was hoarse. The news had spread throughout France as fast as the news of Charles's victory. People couldn't believe it was true, that's Harley. Charles wasn't smitten with her, and he even shot at her. Do you think Charles isn't interested in women? Maybe it's because he has a girlfriend. Is it because of me? Lucia glanced at Charles, a smile creeping onto her lips. Charles looked bewildered, not understanding what Lucia meant, before realizing she had misunderstood. No, Charles lowered his voice. She's a spy, Lucia, a German spy? Lucia looked at Charles in shock, her hand stirring her coffee involuntarily stopping. A spy? Charles nodded, explaining, I've seen her a few times before. I noticed she always seemed to be trying to extract information from officers, and besides, she's the Minister of the Navy's mistress. Lucia was skeptical. Are you sure? This is no small matter. Although Harley herself was of humble status, she had extensive connections and relationships with many powerful figures. Historically, even when she was arrested with conclusive evidence, many high-ranking officials, both domestic and international, pleaded for her. I'm sure, Charles nodded firmly. I intentionally leaked some intelligence to the Minister of the Navy, and without exception, the Germans found out. Lucia instantly understood. Charles had been using Harley to send false information to the Germans. Then, a strange look appeared in Lucia's eyes as she looked at Charles. Perhaps Charles was truly suited for espionage? How could Charles manage to manipulate such a deeply hidden spy, even after receiving false intelligence, and still remain undetected and under his continued use? What Lucia didn't know was that Charles had his own motives for telling her this. Harley would eventually be discovered, and then the Second Bureau might confront Charles. How did you know Harley was a spy and use her? Charles couldn't explain. But if the Madame in White also knew this, Charles could easily answer, I have my own intelligence sources, they told me this. This would create a perfect closed loop. As for whether Charles or the Madame in White knew first, no one could find out in time. Sometimes Charles thought that all those things he shouldn't have known but mysteriously knew could later be attributed to the Madame in White, the Second Bureau investigating the Madame in White? Sorry, if the list were handed over to the Second Bureau for a legitimate investigation, the Madame in White's secret intelligence organization would be exposed. Lucia wasn't thinking about any of that. She glanced at Charles with a bored expression, inwardly sighing, this is what they call wishful thinking, isn't it? He shot Harley because of that. How could it be because of me? Charles never left the unit to go home, even though Darvez wasn't far from Paris, and the soldiers and even the French people understood. French military discipline clearly stipulated that soldiers must obey orders from their superiors and not act without authorization or disobey orders. Charles believed that as an officer, he should set an example, otherwise, what right did he have to criticize or even punish those soldiers who violated discipline? However, Charles still called home to let them know he was safe, but this action terrified Camille. Are you injured? Was it because of the gas? Otherwise, why didn't you come back? You weren't like this before. I'm fine, Mother, Charles replied. Really, I'm fine. It's just that the army didn't give us leave. My unit entered a new training exercise, and I had to stay with them. This was the truth. Under the threat of German poison gas, the demand for gas masks skyrocketed, with both the military and civilians in dire need. However, currently only the military could be supplied, prioritizing frontline troops, followed by medical and logistical reinforcements heading to the front. The 105th Infantry Regiment, having prior experience, was assigned to the police training base to teach these troops how to use gas masks, as well as the precautions for combat while equipped with them. Camille found Charles's explanation reasonable and was somewhat relieved. Finally, Charles added, Steed will send you a few gas masks, This wasn't strictly necessary, as the German gas was unlikely to reach Paris, but it was better to be prepared. It was precisely because of this mentality that Charles's gas masks sold extremely well, and even at 50 francs a set, demand far exceeded supply. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.